Welcome, and thank you for joining us for day 2 of the DC CTSA Spring Regulatory Update and Hot Topics in Clinical and Translational Research. The keynote address will be delivered by Dr. James Giordano on the topic of AI across borders, the need for a cosmopolitan ethic. Dr. James Giordano is professor in the departments of Neurology and Biochemistry, chief of the Neuroethics Studies Program, and chair of the subprogram in Military Medical Ethics at Georgetown University Medical Center, Washington, D.C. Professor Giordano is a bioethicist of the Defense Medical Ethics Center, Distinguished Fellow in Science, Technology, and Ethics at the Stockdale Center of the United States Naval Academy, Senior Fellow in Biosecurity, Technology, and Ethics at the U.S. Naval War College, Newport, Rhode Island, Senior Science Advisory Fellow of the SMA Branch, Joint Staff, Pentagon, and serves as Director of the Institute for Biodefense Research, a federally funded Washington, D.C. think tank dedicated to addressing emerging issues at the intersection of science, technology, and national defense. He previously served as Donovan Group Senior Fellow, U.S. Special Operations Command. Professor Giordano is the author of 325 peer-reviewed publications, 7 books, and 40 governmental reports on brain science and biosecurity, and is an elected member of the European Academy of Science and Arts, a fellow of the Royal Society of Medicine UK, and a Fulbright Professorial Fellow. A former US naval officer, he held designations as an aerospace physiologist and research psychologist and served with the US Navy and Marine Corps.
Hello, I'm Professor James Giordano from the Departments of Neurology, Biochemistry, and the Pellegrino Center for Clinical Bioethics at Georgetown University Medical Center in Washington, D.C. I also work at the Cyber Smart Center of the university, where our ongoing work intersects the role of computational technologies, biomedicine, and ethical, legal, and social issues. Increasingly, artificial intelligence, AI, has become an issue of consideration, one of its capabilities, one of its constraints, and one of its concerns. The concerns that society has about autonomous AI, various forms of AI, and as recent headlines throughout the media have shown, perhaps even sentient AI. And while that latter consideration remains somewhat speculative, if not folly, the trajectory of AI to become ever more capable, ever more competent, and in these ways, ever more a facet of our daily lives is certainly a reality. But more than that, artificial intelligence technology, coupled with the technologies of big data, particularly as they're used in biomedicine, to affect the very essence of our healthcare, and what it means to be healthy, what it means to be well, and what those definitions of norm and abnorm mean for the scope and conduct of not just medical care, but of regard and treatment, becoming a multinational enterprise. But in that multinationality also exists particular distinctions, perhaps asymmetries, and these ways requires prudent address. So today we'll talk about artificial intelligence across borders, but the need for definable boundaries in what AI can do, boundaries in what AI perhaps should do or should not do, and then looking at our own boundaries as to whether or not we can do those things we should. My ongoing work has been supported by a number of different extramural foundations that I've had the privilege of working with at Georgetown and through our ongoing collaborations, and these are shown here. And much of my work has been funded by the United States government, the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, and a number of governmental agencies, inclusive of the National Science Foundation and National Institutes of Health. The views that I present in this presentation do not necessarily reflect those of my funders and those organizations that have provided ongoing support. If we examine artificial intelligence, AI, and in all of its forms, we go from soft AI to intermediate AI to hard AI, definitions you've heard and have been explained elsewhere in this particular seminar and conference. We know that artificial intelligence essentially encompasses 3 domains. There's pure AI, programming systems that are able to perform various tasks, which characteristically require some form of human intelligence, but are then capabilized by various forms of machine systems dynamics, inclusive of machine learning, deep learning, and decision technologies. Evermore, these approaches to information accumulation, assimilation, synthesis, access, and real-world use and applications being engaged in a variety of different domains of the milieu of the human condition, biomedicine being one of them, but also the conduct of our daily lives, to be able to engage adaptive assistive technologies that not only define what it may be to be healthy and how health is then accessed and provided, but also realistically gaining more and more information about the nuances of our daily lives, the nuances of our socioeconomic realities on a host of scales, from the subcellular to the social, from the individual to the international. And what this demonstrates is the ongoing use, or dance, if you will, of tools to theory and theory to tools. We have particular tools of observation, tools of orientation, tools of access, and tools of effect that we can develop our understanding of things. AI, no different, computational systems and what they're capable of doing. And then we employ those tools in ways that allow us to further our understanding. In other words, not only tools to theory, but now theory to tools. In this way, what ends up happening is the theories we develop are put to the test of the tools of observation, inquiry, manipulation, and innovation. And as a consequence, we develop ever new tools. The scope, the depth, and the pace of this cycle, the tools to theory to tools cycle, each and all are increasing as a result of the capability of advanced integrative scientific convergence, and increasing in many ways due to the broad width of viable entertainments and engagements that are being applied. More and more what we're seeing is that the development of tools, the engagements of theories, their research, development, test, evaluation, and uses in practice are becoming a multinational enterprise and effort. And in so doing, we have to ask the question, well, what are these efforts oriented towards? I mean, I think in this way, it becomes important to back away from the forest a little bit to get an overview, and to not only come in closer to take a look at each individual tree, what these various systems may yield, obtain, and entail, but then once again to prescind, to take that 30,000-foot view. What is the shape that each tree is be able to assume that we've created? How is it that this forest is growing, not only by our own design and engineering, but perhaps organically? How is it indeed that the very roots of what it is we're trying to plant may develop ever more broad and high branches, some of them beyond our reach, perhaps? I mean, I think if we consider this metaphor, the low-hanging fruit, if you will, are definable goods, those things that we seek to engage, to obtain, to utilize, to maximize and optimize, that we define as good. In other words, benevolent aims, developing science and technology, AI being no different, towards sustainable, definable goods. What are those goods? I mean, realistically, if those are the low-hanging fruit, well, what are the branches of that tree that we've planted to produce those goods, or those means to acquire those goods? Primary goods, secondary, and instrumental. In other words, what good? What goods? What services? What resources? What goals? What ends? Here, I paraphrase the work of the moral philosopher Alistair MacIntyre of the University of Notre Dame. What goods? What justice? What rationale? How do we determine the allocation and appropriation of those things we define as good? What is the rationale for that? But more than that, more fundamentally, perhaps the ground truth being, maybe these goods are not uniform. What is seen as goods by some may not be seen as goods by others, or may be totally contrary to those goods viewed by others. So the question then is, what are we really doing in our appropriations and views of artificial intelligence, particularly as it relates to the multicultural dynamics of the current milieu of AI science and technology, its development and its various applications? We have to view cultures as both if you will, forums for the development of various ideas, ideologies, patterns, programs, needs, values, philosophies, and ethics, as well as constraints. And indeed, when these are multicultural, then the question becomes, how well do these things work together? How well do these fora of development, how well do these considerations, consternations about the various constraints and applications and capabilities merge? What are their similarities? What are their differences? So although we may be vision casting with much of our approaches to current artificial intelligence in terms of what can be done and even what should be done, we also have to cast a bit of shade. Can we do the things we should? And how is it that we define what those shoulds are? Is there a process that is currently in place that allows for that level of not simply discourse, but perhaps true dialectic? Dialectic that builds upon not only various theses for what is good and what AI does, can do, and should do, but perhaps antitheses. What could go wrong? How are rights and wrongs defined? How are goods and not goods, goods and anti-goods defined and discerned? And then how do we bring those theses and antitheses into some viable perspective in the real world, given the realities and eventualities of the progression of AI? Given that what certain constraints in one domain may obtain and entail may provide an opportunistic window to be able to then fill those gaps elsewhere. In other words, if we, whoever we may be, decide that certain things and uses of AI are beyond the scope or beyond the pale of our ethical constraint, well, are such ethical constraints uniform? And if we, whoever we may be, don't go there, wherever there may be, is that going to be a universal prohibition against going there? Or does that actually create opportunities to then fill that void of there? And then what does that mean for relative capability, leverageability of the techniques, the capabilities, the capacities, and in some cases, the control that such AI may render, and the relative hegemonies, truly the balances of capability and power that can then be exercised in a variety of demands in the 21st century global stage. In so doing, we have to consider that any science and technology, although aimed at benevolent goals, wanting to do good, can incur particular burdens. There's no free lunch. Every coin has two sides, and AI and the systems that contribute to AI, decision technologies, machine learning, big data, each and all have, if you will, a side or aspect that can be construed as at least somewhat provocative, if not problematic and contentious. And if we take a look at the ethical, legal, and social issues and risks, these can be basically parsed into two intersecting domains. Those that are focal to the technology itself, AI, big data, and the fusion of AI and big data into a host of different scientific and technological approaches and applications are relatively new. And as such, what is known remains proximate, but what is unknown in terms of the dynamics of these systems and tools themselves and their focal as well as diverse interactions exist over the horizon of our current sphere of knowledge. Certain things can be modeled, certain things can be gained, but others cannot. And while it's fairly easy to make predictions about the interaction dynamics, effects, and manifestations of science and technology in that vista of probability, which occurs within perhaps the next 60 calendar months based upon the current trajectories of progress, once we get beyond that, moving into the vista of possibility, what then would be from 6 to 15 years in the future. And beyond that, the vista and horizons of potentiality, 15 to 30 years in the future, become far more difficult to model. Not impossible, but in many cases, that modeling, that gaming, that speculation and predictive capability is contingent and dependent in part upon the science and technology itself. The use of machine learning, decision technologies, and AI to model and predict the trajectories and effects of machine learning, decision technologies, and AI. Is that performative or is that precise? What are the actual capabilities and limitations that these various iterations of science and technology can and likely will assume? What is the validity and viability of their use, and therefore, what is their relative, if not real, value? And with value and with viability comes demand. But more than that, with viability also comes some level of sustainability, the actual inherent vivacity of the systems themselves. In other words, how vital are these systems? And what I mean by vital is not only vital as tools in our employ, we as the human builders and users, but how vital are the tools themselves? In other words, what is their inherent sustainability? What is their self-sustainability? Now, we could venture here down the road, if not rabbit hole, of the possibility of sentient AI or self-recognizing AI and what that might incur. And some of the work of our group has certainly addressed that. And this is on the lips not only of the academic, scholarly, and technological community at present, but has really worked its way into the public forum as well. But irrespective of that, these systems seek to be sustainable. They are designed to be sustainable by virtue of the fact that such sustainability allows their durable function in and across a variety of conditions. Are there constraints? What are the mechanisms of command and control? And how capable are those mechanisms of command and control? Might the systems run away from our command and control? And or might we, as the builders and users, run away in our desires, and increasing desires enforce the technological imperative that has been discussed by philosophers such as Hans Lenk and Hans Jonas, to essentially build it if we can, use it once we build it, and then in these ways create new dynamics, new quasi-calculi, if you will, of demand, supply, and with supply, service, and with service, capability, and with capability, therefore, deconstraint, which then might incur what are sometimes referred to as Wechselblatt effects. In other words, if we change the nature of things by increasing or changing, altering particular capabilities and capacities, do we know what lurks over the horizon? And are we ready for that? Ready for that on a variety of levels, not least of which in our civic and social capabilities, which then brings us to those socially derivative issues that occur as a consequence of emerging and currently used technologies. Some of these issues include the autonomy of the systems themselves and whether or not these systems will in some way impede, intrude, or impugn the autonomy of human users. What will happen to our capabilities, for example, as artificially intelligent systems, machine learning, and decision technologies assume more and more of those tasks and therefore become far more capable tools that may be independent of our employ? How will that shift, if you will, the socioeconomic domains, dimensions, and dynamics of what we're doing as builders and users, share and stakeholders? How aware are we, whoever the we's may be, that not only build and construct the technologies as engineers of its evolution, but also as co-participants in the evolution of those systems as they become more capable? Do we understand what these things are being used for? And is there that level of consent with all of those necessary contingencies that go into consent for the use of these systems in and across the various domains and dimensions of human endeavor? And the question then becomes not only how we will use this, but for whom will we use these things? How will the benefits of these systems and application be provided commutatively, distributively, in terms of provision and access, not only to the systems themselves, but to the relative goods that these systems are oriented to achieve? And again, this then gets back to consent for their use or non-use, and what kinds of uses. Again, in full transparency, I must tell you that much of my ongoing work has been funded by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the Department of Defense and intelligence communities here in the United States and internationally. And science and technology of any brand, of any type, of any form, has been and will be considered for, if not directly taken into the use of various agendas of national security, intelligence, and defense. The more sophisticated and capable the tools we have, the more viable and perceived as valuable their utility in sustaining and maintaining what a group, a collective, a culture holds to be right and good. In other words, to defend and advance those ideas, ideologies, ways of life, from the social all the way to the political, and certainly the economic, that that particular collective, group, culture, or nation may hold to be near and dear. And certainly science and technology allows for insights to those things that may threaten or impugn, and therefore provides capability to defend kin and kith. And here, when we talk about kin and kith, we're talking about not just physical kin and kith, biological kin and kith, but ideological kin and kith, economic kin and kith, and in that way, capabilities on the global stage. And this then gets into issues of dual usability of AI and AI technologies in and across a whole range of various forms of engagement, from the non-kinetic, the economic, the informational, the narrative, and the subtle control that that incurs, to the kinetic, utilizing AI systems for frank warfare, bellicosity. But I think it becomes important to understand that if we look within the non-kinetic domain, not necessarily as one of warfare per se, but one of ongoing engagement that seeks to advance various initiatives and agenda towards establishing capability in a range of different applications, from a simple performative capability in terms of who's got the best tools and what they can do, to what that then yields. The development of tools is towards some end, and very often those ends are important for economic gains. Economic gains directly by the development of the tool itself, or economic gains indirectly, somewhat more implicitly downstream or downrange, as these technologies afford increased capability to be leveraged in and across a variety of different applications and different economic spheres. This has not gone unnoticed on the global stage. The proverbial new global shift, as described by the international scholar, Dr. Roland Benedicter, has shown, I think quite conclusively, that it's no longer just, in quotes, the West and the rest, but rather that multinational capabilities are on the rise. And along with those multinational capabilities must be consideration, and in some regard, real regards and concerns for the multiculturality, the historical, the valuative, philosophical, ethical multiculturality and multinationality that these engagements therefore obtain. Different nations have different cultures, both intranationally and internationally, and those cultures, like any culture, think here of a petri dish, reiteratively is both a forum and, if you will, a constraint. It provides the medium by which various ideas, needs, wants, values develop historically, and it provides relative parameterization for how those various needs, desires, and values can be expressed, utilizing whatever means and or tools may be at the disposal. But how solid are the boundaries, are the walls of those dishes of culture? They're not just opaque, they're becoming, in many ways, diffuse, osmotic. Our science and technology allows an intercultural exchange, at least of information, if not ways of life. And it's not so much whether or not we're dealing with, quote, melting pot phenomenon, but realistically the stew of the new global shift. And think literally, metaphorically, of a stew. It's not a question of things blending into some homogeneous mass, but rather things retaining their relative flavor as well as their relative history. How is it that the various ingredients that go into a stew were grown, developed, and ultimately contribute to the flavor, to the nutritability of that stew? If we take a look at AI science and technology on the 21st century global stage, we have to appreciate that it's increasingly multinational. There are defined and increasing Asian efforts, and certainly this is advancing within primarily developed nations, but not just. Just today, as a matter of fact, headlines in the international media have detailed that increasingly developing and even some heretofore non-developed nations are gaining inroads and utilizing accessibility, capability of emerging forms of science and technology, inclusive of information technology and AI, to be able to gain a place on this new, shifted global world stage. By the exchange of information, via various capabilities that can be yielded through the use of infrastructures and functions and geographies. In some cases, the limitations of those geographies disappear, given the capabilities that AI may have to create networks of information that are relatively independent of actually geographic locales. So although it's capabilizing developing nations, there's also establishing particular techno-socioeconomic leverage and capability that now creates new contingencies, new opportunities, new challenges, and in some cases may lessen asymmetries, but in other cases may actually broaden asymmetries that exist between developed, developing, and non-developed nations. This prompts, if not realistically sustains, and I would say warrants considerations of what the French existential philosopher Michel Foucault referred to as biopower, the capability to affect individuals and collectives' biologies, and in those ways exercise some leverage, hegemony, and therefore power within and over them. And when this is then done within a particular collective or between particular collectives, this can then be considered biopolitics. But evermore, such biopower and biopolitics are being affected, being enacted through the use of the tools we have. Literally, the techne, a Greek term that means not just the tools, but how those tools are used. We are, in fact, not just Homo sapiens, but much of our sapient nature, the fact that we consider ourselves to be knowledgeable and wise, are the results of the tools that we have at hand and those that we then require to advance our capabilities of knowledge and our capabilities of skill and articulation. AI is no different. We are Homo sapiens technicus. Question now becomes, who would be Homo sapiens technologicus? Will we take a logical and rational accounting of the tools that we are developing and have developed and the way those tools are used and perhaps the way those tools function, both in our hands and beyond our hands? And therefore, we have to consider techno-biopower and techno-biopolitics. And in so doing, it becomes important to understand how these tools affect the relative balance of goods, services, and resources locally, regionally, and globally. And when we consider those households, the use of those goods and those resources to affect local, regional, and international basis of capability and power, wealth, then this gets us into economics, literally economics. And now we have to confront the bioeconomy. Our ongoing work is primarily focused upon the interaction of artificially intelligent systems, big data, machine learning with biomedicine and bioscientific development. And this really, in many ways, gets at the roots of interactions between the technological capabilities at hand and those that are on the proverbial drawing board set for translation, and the ability to utilize those techniques and technologies in ways that affect a variety of dimensions of human and other organismal life on the planet. AI being no different, and AI being a profoundly potent mechanism by which we can integrate massive data in and across scales of space, time, level, so as to be able to create a more integrative understanding. And in this way, perhaps definition, description, and prediction of what this information means and how said information can then be utilized to develop new tools and new methods, and or how the information itself can be utilized. And in this way, what we find is that it affects the capabilities on a variety of scales. Certainly monetary scales, financial scales, scales of resource acquisition, allocation, use, and distribution. And when considering the AI techno-bioeconomy, it becomes important to consider what our group has referred to as the big C's: scientific integrative convergence and convergence of systems, as well as the lack of convergence of systems. And then what does that mean for multinational and international collaboration? What does it mean for cooperativity, both within the systems and within those who build the systems and use the systems? But given the fact that these systems very often yield prizes, if you will, yield outcomes, deliverables that are economically, socially, politically capable, and therefore influential, there is the competitive aspect as well. And in some cases, competition escalates to conflict. Not necessarily armed conflict, but perhaps conflict between the systems themselves, what systems can do, what systems should do, differing opinions, differing views, different capabilities. And then in other cases, true conflict, the use of these systems in highly competitive and conflicting ways. Conflict between collectives, between nations, and then the environment, the milieu of AI itself to be, if you will, a new conflict domain, a new battle space, as we're already seeing. Each and all of these establish a variety of different contingencies, and those contingencies are the contingencies based upon differences as well as similarities in culture. The various circumstances and contexts within a culture that define needs, values, ideas, ideals, the various philosophies that are important to establishing ethics, and what are the ethical goals. In other words, if the goal here is to be able to achieve said goods, and those goods might differ as well as might be the same, what is it that those differences and similarities confer? And how might the use of these goods, the acquisition of these goods, and the leveraging of these goods impart capabilities for control? Control in terms of commercial control and economic capability, as well as capitalization and relative hegemony on a variety of scales, not least of which it's a control of the systems themselves and how those systems then exert control back upon human users and human systems. Once again, I think it becomes important to appreciate culture as a medium and a forum. A medium, literally, that gives rise to a thing, and a forum that provides particular opportunities for constraint or deconstraint. Culture, in its strictest sense, has a history. What goes into that culture, whether it's a petri dish or whether it's a national culture, an identity or collective culture, what is required to sustain that culture? What has grown as a set of needs based upon the history of that culture? What things have been done in the past that create particular needs and values desiderata, both at present and in the future? And very often, those histories of those individuals and those people define what is known and how it's known about their various needs, their various values, their contingencies, their exigencies, how those things are enacted in the anthropological domain of the reality of individuals and groups, and how those anthropological considerations establish what those groups of people individually and collectively define to be good, which then brings us into the ethical domain. So cultural philosophies certainly reflect anthropological factors, ecological and economic factors, and taken together, these help to establish ethics. Well, I think what becomes important to understand is that increasingly, the cultural basis of AI development and use is becoming heterogeneous. And the very technologies of AI, machine learning, computational, and communicative systems is such that the ubiquity of information that we're being faced with demands a relative intercultural interface to be able to maximize the information at these systems and ultimately our disposal. How will we share certain information? How will we develop those systems to allow that level of sharing, or in some cases to restrict that level of sharing? And does sharing or non-sharing create particular contingencies and exigencies as regard to capability, to control, to command, to power? How will we use these systems? How should we use these systems? Again, let's recall the ideas of Professor Roland Benedicter. It's no longer the West and the rest, but increasingly that the capabilities that are being conferred by if you will, the credibility and clout of a variety of cultures to create inroads in viable systems that are exercisable on the global stage gives them a place at the proverbial table. And I'm not just speaking metaphorically here. I had the privilege and honor for a number of years of working with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And economic cooperation and development axiomatically brings into stark relief and into the bright light of reality the fact that any and all groups, any and all collectives, or even individuals that are developing capabilities in these ways are able to leverage and utilize those capabilities economically to affect ecologies, to affect environments, and ultimately to affect stability. Stability for what? What goods? Well, we need to appreciate ever more that non-Western orientations may be very, very important as these various cultures gain the capability to predict, to influence, and therefore, in some cases, to direct what these services, goods, and tools may render and afford. Right from Confucius comes the idea of don't impose upon others what you yourself do not desire, a maxim reflective, if not directly supportive of the proverbial golden rule. But what we do understand equally from Asian cultures is that humans tend to follow their society. The society develops as a consequence of human needs and values, and those humans are participatory and contingent. And in some cases, are far more collectivist than we were accustomed to seeing based upon our prior 100-year history. But more than that, the question is then how do we approach these heterogeneities, these relative distinctions? Again, the idea of two dialectic may be important. And again, we can turn to various Asian philosophies to import that a gentleman, if you will, one that is civilized. And what I mean by that, working within civic institutions within the civilization at hand, gets along with others, but need not necessarily agree with them. What does that then mean to get along with but not agree? What are the bases of consensus and dissensus, and how do we develop systems for the articulation of AI tools on the multinational stage? Well, I think one of the bases for this must be considerations of relative safety. Many of the discourses that we entertain in the media, both professional as well as public, deal with the relative safety of AI and AI type systems. Quality control, quality assurance, different methods and technologies, and whether or not there's going to be cooperativity, and whether or not these things are co-functional, whether or not there is indeed confluence of these systems or divergence of these systems. And if in fact these things occur, what does that mean economically? If we're to make AI systems that are going to be uniformly operative and interoperability is a consideration, well, what's it going to cost? What's it going to cost if we don't? And then ultimately, if systems are being developed independently, does such independence necessarily afford competition? Is there some way whereby cooperation and competition can be reconciled? And then here we have to consider what these systems might be used for. And now we deal with influence or security concerns. But I think going forward, it becomes very important to understand that a simple precautionary principle really would not work. A simple precautionary principle would state, for example, that if the burdens or risks outweigh the benefits, don't go. But break, folks. Here's some breaking news. The potential burdens and potential risks and threats will always be somewhat greater, at least theoretically, than the benefits. The reason being that the benefits, those benevolent goals, are apparent and are proximate. They are the low-hanging fruit. But the deeper we plant the roots and the faster that proverbial tree grows, the higher those branches essentially extend. And these things may be beyond our view. Literally, in this particular case, the reach of those branches may exceed our current grasp. So we have to consider the fact that burdens, as well as risks and potential threats and harms, are iterative and developing. It doesn't necessarily preclude going forward, particularly if the benefits are real, apparent, and are profound. But we must be considered that the more and diverse use of these various forms of AI and the differences in their systems themselves may incur burdens that are heretofore unforeseen. Are we ready for these things? Preparedness for this does not equal prevention of the relative promise of positive outcomes. And a readiness stance and readiness posture must be therefore focused, flexible, and fast-moving in adapting to the capabilities of the science and technology at hand. In some cases, the autogenerative capabilities of that science and technology. It becomes important to recognize and be responsive to both idiosyncratic and systemic benefits, burdens, risks, threats, and harms. Not just those things that occur on individual levels, however individuality may be described literally as individual and unique persons, units, but also within individual collectives and cultures, as well as the systems that are involved, the systems of co-participation and co-engagement, and perhaps the system writ large on the global stage. Which then brings us to the need for some form of AI ethics on the world stage. Could I describe to you exactly what that ethics is? No, because it needs to be a work in progress as the work progresses, as the work in AI and its capability progresses. But it does have to be cosmopolitanly cognizant, literally aware of multiple forms of different groups, peoples, and cultures that are involved both in the development and applications of AI and those that are not, and what those distinctions mean. It has to be capable to function within and between communities, and it has to accommodate pluralist needs, values, norms, and mores as affected by and as affecting various forms of economic, political, and power balance domains. And because these are the realistic fabrics of any ethical effort. And good ethics must be all about the particularities of the enterprise, effort, and endeavor at hand. How to go forward? Well, at very, very least, it becomes important to evaluate the risks and seek to prevent or mitigate them as best possible. Our group, working together with our national and international colleagues in 2015 and then subsequently in 2018, proposed what we refer to as on-ramp, an operational neo-technologic risk assessment and mitigation paradigm. We coined it on-ramp because we view these emerging scientific and technological inroads as a super speedway. I think the analogy, the metaphor obtains and carries quite well. I mean, if you think of, let's say, a Formula One race, think of Le Mans, multiple lanes, multiple entries, each and all being punctuated and defined by state-of-the-art technological and scientific advancement. Realistically, a very, very fast pace. And a fast pace towards what? Well, there's not only cooperation within teams and in some cases between teams, but there's definitively competition for big prizes. And those prizes translate beyond the proverbial track. You know, what happens in Formula One doesn't stay in Formula One, so to speak. In other words, those developments that create winning formulaics on the racetrack are very often translated into applications in the daily driver. And then how do those things influence the scope and quality of our lives, not only in our cars, but the way we get from point A to point B, and what does that then mean for the overall race? But along with that come certain risks. Not only risks for those going around the track at high speed, but very often for those who are in attendance, those who are observing. And given the translation of things from track to road, if you will, from grandstand to garage, so to speak, benefits, burdens, and risks are translatable on a variety of levels, inclusive of those things that are somewhat more quotidian. So if in fact you're going to get on that track, and this is not a question really of if, because we already are on that track, then it becomes important to do certain things as we gain the entrance to the track, as we enter the track, as we get on the on-ramp. The on-ramp paradigm begins with the 6R approach, predicated with responsibility for realistic assessment of the technology, ongoing research to evaluate its use and effects in practice, responsiveness, not only to the benefits that are incurred, but also to burdens and perhaps deleterious effects that are not only being incurred, but could be incurred with each and all steps forward. And in appreciating those things, revisions in the technology and the way that technology is marketed and described. And in those ways, such descriptions need to effectively, accurately inform regulation and policy to ensure rigor in development and claims. But to adopt this 6R approach necessitates key questions that must be framed within definable parameters. Any consideration of using AI, science, and technology in this particular on-ramp approach must begin from addressing 6 what we call W questions. What science and technologies are currently available for use, and what are their limitations and capabilities? Why is a particular science and technology, inclusive of those that are current and those that are emerging, considered being advocated for use? Who will receive it? When will it be considered? And what algorithm, what protocol, what is the application process? Where will it be engaged? What locale, what nation, what domain, and which mechanisms will be in place for ongoing provision of services and resources, not only to keep the thing running, but to be able to assess and perhaps intervene if and when things begin to go wrong. And they will. Not a question of if, it's a question of when and to what extent. But here too, these things should not be ambiguous. They should be specific, and disambiguating these questions is important by framing them within 6C considerations. What are the actual capacities and limitations of the science and technology as it iteratively develops? What are the consequences that are incurred by the science and technology on individuals and systems in the short, intermediate, and long term, as well as what might be the consequences of not developing or using this technology? Here, we need to consider benefits, burdens, and risks of both commission, doing the thing, or omission, not doing the thing. What is the character of the use case and the users that are affected by either neurotechnology or cyber technology? In other words, how is it that these various forms of cyber technology, AI technology, are being employed? What is the character of the research and the use? Biomedicine, lifestyle, economics, national security and defense, and ultimately in each one of these, if you will, characterological considerations, we have particular contexts of the ecologies and the, if you will, parameters that are necessary to describe the needs and values that influence that particular science and technology within that frame. And ultimately, if we employ or don't employ that science and technology in these particular characters of application and context of use, there must be continuity of research and continuity of revision of what we know, how we know it, and what we do with the things we have and what we do about the things we don't. And if we're going to employ this science and technology in collectives and communities, well, then we have to appreciate that those collectives and communities are not esoteric, but rather are made up of human users, are made up of defined environments, ecologies, and resources that affect humans. And as such, awareness, communication, and consent becomes critical. It becomes difficult when considering the particularity of certain collective efforts, particularly if the collectiveness of those efforts involve distinctions, differences, heterogeneities, and orientations and approaches to various forms of needs, values, and ethics. When various groups come together to engage, to address, to decide upon if and what forms of AI should be developed and articulated in various forms of practice and application, it becomes important to define contexts, to define and set ethical goals and ideals. And there are a number of different ways to do that. Our group has argued strongly for something of a Risherian framework and is both prescriptive and conclusive, and in these ways allows some projective capability. But it also has to be deeply discursive, establishing ethical sets and goals by examining perspectives, orientations, presuppositions of the discourse, but doing that in a way that is truly dialectic. We've advocated, for example, some of the work of Jürgen Habermas in a discursive approach, but also a Hegelian form of dialectic. And that's a lot of philosophical name dropping in one sentence, but it serves to provide at least demonstration, if not some illustration, that there are tools that are available, there are methods that are available. And perhaps it's not a question of using them per se, but using them as the basis for revision to develop methods and approaches anew. One possible way to doing that is using some form of a reflective equilibrium. And one consideration has been that advocated by the philosopher John Rawls. However, there are certain constraints within a Rawlsian equilibrium that I think need to be reconsidered and perhaps revised in light of the capabilities of the science and technology of AI and decision learning systems. Toward that end, our group, working with others, has proposed more of a Thagard-based equilibrium, identifying domains of practices, candidate norms for the practices, appropriate goals, evaluating the extent to which different practices accomplish these goals, and then adopting as domain norms those that best accomplish those goals given the individuals and collectives of shared stakeholders and users that are involved. And in so doing, to adopt norms that best accomplish those goals, here, it might be useful to engage a Rawlsian maxi-min or mini-max attempt that maximizes possible gain while minimizing loss and confers benefit to those that might be least advantaged. And this way establishes particular parameters for consensus, inclusive consensus in what areas dissent may occur. So we need to go forward. Why? Because, if you will, both the inertia and the momentum of current scientific and technological development in AI will, in those ways, propel us forward. The goal, the aim, is to be prepared as we are propelled. And so we may ask, where are we going from here? What must we do? Well, I think what becomes very important is cashing the proverbial reality check in ways that are perspectively sound, having some humility for our own capabilities and recognizing without hubris what we can and cannot do, and being thankful for those systems that are in place, and I think being appreciative of those that are not, so that we may need to develop them. This requires realistic insight. It requires some savvy to the techno-economic realities of the changing, rapidly shifting architectonics of the 21st century global stage. It also requires security by design, not after the fact, but inherent and intrinsic to the practices and protocols as well as actual tools themselves. And in so doing, creating that relative security, is going to demand ethical insights and articulation. But here too, this must be globally, cosmopolitanly relevant, appreciative, and responsive. In lectures such as this, I very often like to end on something of a personal note. And for those of you who've heard some of my lectures before, I don't want to devolve into my father telling the same story over and over again, but this is a story about my father. And when my dad and I were sort of having when I was a kid, my dad and I had father-son activity, which was involved in building certain things. My dad was an engineer. And one of the things he liked to do is fix things, restore things. And it was something that he and I shared. It was something I still like to do. And my dad was a pretty good teacher as well. And one of the things that he would do is he would introduce a new tool to me every month. He would usually do it on the first Tuesday of the month. It was called New Tool Tuesday. We started doing this when I was around 6 years old. I first started to gain some interest of what dad's doing down in a workshop. So think about it. A new tool every month. After a while, I got to be pretty good with tools and had a pretty good knowledge base in how to use these things with my dad's mentorship and supervision. I remember I must have been about 10 years old. And it was New Tool Tuesday. Now, a little simple math here. If I started this when I was around 6, and I'm now 10, that's about 48 tools in my toolkit. Right? That's not shy. That's a pretty broad set of tools that I had at least insight, if not full capability to use, right? Or at least I thought I did. And I remember it was New Tool Tuesday. We were working on something down in the workshop. My dad comes home from work. I was really excited. My dad, he says, here's the new tool for the day. I was like thrilled. I grabbed the tool. I was like, okay, great. I went to go running down to the workshop. My dad put his hand on my shoulder and said, hey, Jim, slow down here. You need to measure twice before you make the cut. Measure twice, cut once, because sometimes with tools like this, this is important. You can't take back what you've done. That's great advice. And it's advice that I passed from my father down to you. Realistically, the take-home message here is to measure twice and cut once when we deal with AI, its systems, and the ethics and policies necessary to guide and govern it. Reflection, insight, prudence must be the stepping stones for any and all future acts of our inquiry, invention, intervention. And by stepping stones, I mean it's important to understand our footfall effects, not to essentially stop ourselves dead in our tracks, but to be aware of where we're placing our feet, whereas the relative benefits and burdens may lie, so as to remain stable and balanced with each and every step forward, irrespective of whatever forces may act upon our posture. Measure twice and cut once. For all too often, there is no turning back. If you're interested in additional readings that our group has created and some of the ongoing work that we've done over the past decade or so, I provide these for you here. And if you'd like to get in touch with me, if you have questions, you have comments, and like to expand the discourse, I'd be happy to do so. Feel free to reach me at james.giordano@georgetown.edu. Thanks very much for your time. I hope you found the lecture informative and interesting as well. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Giordano. Indeed, we have an opportunity for questions and answers, and we already have our first question here regarding this very rich and challenging talk that you provided, bringing into stark relief some of the challenges that artificial intelligence poses to all of us. So clearly, if I can kind of oversimplify, some of the key points, clearly we have to be really critical and focused and mindful about at least two components in this process: the values that go into its design, as well as the values that go into the applications. And it seems that while we may be more successful, or we may have the tools to regulate the values that go into the applications, it seems to be particularly challenging to evaluate the values and the goods that we assume in the design process. So I hope that we could address some of these issues in the conversation here. But let me start with the first question from the audience, and it is, are the regulatory agencies equipped with the expertise in artificial intelligence to provide proper oversight?
It's a good question. Yes and no. It really depends. It depends on three things. Number one, what are the agencies we're looking at? In some cases, they're well equipped and understand the need for subject matter experts that are interdisciplinary. I mean, not just multidisciplinary, but interdisciplinary, because that's important. Having a reciprocal understanding of the science and technology and those necessary social factors that go into ethical and legal appreciation on the global stage really undergird the dynamics of any ethical approach that's going to be genuine or authentic and does what it's supposed to do in real world terms, number one. Number two, it's also a question of where it's being done. Now, that's not to say that ethics here versus ethics there might be considerably different, but the actual precepts and constructs can be relatively preserved within borders, so to speak. In other words, what I do in my living room tends to preserve what I want to have done in my living room. So the larger issue is not so much a question of are the necessary subject matter expertise being focal to the ethical enterprise, but are the ethical enterprises going to be multiply engaged so as to allow not just the discourse, but a dialectical discourse? And that's big. I don't have the answer to that question. My hope is that it will. And the third factor is, does there come that particular point when suddenly things go stale? And what we mean by that is we reach an asymptote, where at that point, the technological progress supersedes our capability to work promptly and effectively. Again, a form of runaway or Vexelblad effect. And there's been considerable literature that has addressed just these types of things. And clearly, the forthcoming panel that begins to address some of these safety and security issues with my colleagues Bill Caisbier, with Professor Frieder, with Dr. Diane Diulis, will examine these in greater detail. And so I think that the answer to that question, at least in part, will be provided in our subsequent discussion.
Thank you very much. I don't see another question coming from the audience at the moment. Oh, yes, we have another one. Then I'll hold on my own question. Okay. What can the lay public do to ensure the questions, insights, and ethical considerations are considered when AI products are being designed or developed?
You know, as you could tell from my speech impediment, I was born and raised in New York City. And I grew up in New York City in the 1960s and 1970s. And there was a clothing store in New York called Sims. I think it's still there. And they used to have a commercial where the guy who owned the store, his name was Cy Sims. And then ultimately he brought his daughter, Marcy Sims, on. And they'd sit in front of the camera and they go, "At Sims, an educated consumer is our best customer." Boom, brilliant. With each and all of these domains of science and technology that are relevant to ethical, legal, and social issues, an educated consumer is going to be the best share and stakeholder. But although it just took me the better part of 3 seconds to get that out of my mouth, that's not easy to do, because the nature of educating the consumers becomes an ongoing process in light of what the science and technology can achieve, and therefore a deeper understanding of what it should or should not do in a variety of applications, which is why the programs we're trying to develop here in the CTSA are so important. Not only within the proverbial parameters of the academic ivory tower, but as outreach to be able to provide reliable resources for the public to be able to get valid, truthful information about what the science and technology can do, and in these ways gave deeper understanding to the discourses and dialectics about what it should or shouldn't.
Thank you. And although we're coming close to the end of our time, I would like to very much ask you the following question. We know that bias has plagued research, especially clinical research, for quite some time. And it's been also one of the challenges when thinking about artificial intelligence. To what extent are we capable of eliminating bias? And what is like the technological capability to deal with bias in the process of artificial intelligence construction and design?
It's really a question for Professor Frieder. What we need to consider is two things. Number one, in any one of these particular systems, there tends to be what's called a development diathesis, which is a fancy way of saying a builder's bias. We put certain biases into the system, and what that tends to reflect is either the biases that are inherent to the system, or even in some cases, idiosyncratic biases that the system could develop. Characteristically, there's been an argument, and this is the Pilkington argument, that in any system such as this, any AI or machine learning system, you're going to have infused traits of the developer that in some cases are explicit, in other cases are tacit. And you simply can't get around that. One way to possibly get around that is to something called generative encoding that has autopoietic capability. A lot of fancy words. In other words, what the system does is you don't necessarily build anything into the system other than the capacity to learn. So the system learns how to learn and then puts that to work. But the argument contra that has been that as long as there is human engagement with that system, either in the loop or on the loop, there is the potential vectoring of bias, again, either explicitly or tacitly. The argument in extremis is that as a consequence, these systems should be built in such a way that function autonomously with humans out of the loop so as to preserve against intrinsic or extrinsic human bias, whereby the system itself maximizes a set of key variables, even if those key variables are the primacy of human benefit as its key focal interest, but doing so in a way that allows for integration of vast amounts of information, and in this way appreciates broader scenarios, both contemporarily and across what may be future vistas. If we look at this, you have defensible arguments on both sides. And this is why I think the idea of autonomous or non-autonomous systems, human in and on the loop versus humans out of the loop, very often can be distilled down to influences and bias. And if in fact those biases represent good things, particularly when it comes to human preservation versus integrity of the machine system alone, but also what human preservation means in terms of what's being preserved, not just human, quote, life per se, vis-a-vis Terminator scenarios, which can in some cases be fictional, but in other cases not. But more than that, what are the actual decisions that these various decision technologies can articulate so as to be able to appreciate human values focal to the context on a range that goes from the individual to the systemic to the international? And that's, I think, a larger enterprise and one underway, one ongoing.
Thank you very much once again, Dr. Giordano.
Pleasure.
And while we close formally our keynote session, we remain with the topic of artificial intelligence across borders with our panel that's coming up next. So I'll turn over to Dr. Sarah Vitton from Georgetown University to introduce the next panel.
Thank you, Dr. Paskalev and Dr. Giordano for getting us started this afternoon. I am very pleased to introduce the first panel for today. And the three speakers, here they are. I'm very pleased to have time for us to spend together. So I'm going to introduce them all now. And then our first speaker will be Dr. Frieder. So I'd like to take the time now to give a nice introduction. Dr. Diane Deulius is a senior research fellow at the National Defense University. Her research areas focus on emerging biological technologies, biodefense, and preparedness for biothreats. Specific topic areas under this broad research portfolio include dual-use life sciences research, synthetic biology, the U.S. bioeconomy, disaster recovery, and behavioral, cognitive, and social science as it relates to important aspects of deterrence. Dr. Deulius currently has several research grants in progress and teaches in foundational, professional, military education. Prior to joining the National Defense University, Dr. Deulius was Deputy Director for Policy and served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy and Planning in the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, Department of Health and Human Services. She coordinated policy and research in support of domestic and international health emergencies, such as Hurricane Sandy and the Ebola outbreaks. She was responsible for implementation of the Pandemic All Hazards Preparedness Act, the National Health Security Strategy, and supported the Public Health Emergency Medical Countermeasures Enterprise. I'd like to also introduce is the Director of Artificial Intelligence and Machine Learning in Riverside Research's Open Innovation Center. Bill's lab uses next generation technology to advance human-machine teaming, neuromorphic computing, object and activity classification and recognition, and defensive and offensive cyber warfare capabilities. Bill has decades of experience leading interdisciplinary teams of scientists and engineers to creative solutions in pressing national security problems, including director, senior director, and program manager roles at Scientific Systems Company, Inc., the Innovation Lab at Beyond Conflict, the Human Systems and Autonomy Lab at Lockheed Martin's Advanced Technology Laboratories, and at the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, also known as DARPA. While at DARPA, Bill served as program manager in both the Defense Sciences Office and the Biological Technologies Office. And finally, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ophir Frieder, who focuses on scalable information processing systems with particular emphasis on health informatics. He's a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the Association for Computing Machinery, the American Institute for Medical and Biological Engineering, the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, and a member of the Academia Europa and the European Academy of Sciences and Arts. Heavily involved with industrial efforts, he is the lead science and technology advisor for Aurora Forge and the Chief Science Officer of Invariant, Inc. He is a member of the computer science faculty at Georgetown University and the biostatistics, bioinformatics, and biomathematics faculty in the Georgetown University Medical Center. And I'm pleased to ask Dr. Frieder to open the remarks for our panel. Dr. Frieder, you have the floor.
Perfect. It opened. It's always nice when technology works. Well, thanks for the introduction. It's an honor to be here. I was asked to speak on harnessing AI to healthcare from research to practice. Now, those of us who are academics know that moving research into practice is not exactly a foray and a big success of most academic institutions. So besides being a member of the computer science department and the biostatistics, bioinformatics, and biomathematics here at Georgetown University Medical Center, I am also as you heard, a member of the Aurora Forge and the Chief Scientific Officer of Invariant. And then that's what I'm going to actually rely upon to talk about today, since my goal is to show you how research taken from potentially academic infrastructure can be moved to practice, and that particularly for health tech IT is via industry. But I'm relying based on this talk on a variety of different experiences. Obviously, the Aurora Forge and Invariant, but also Quantify, which was recently bought by Sondermind, which is supporting mental health detection and care via technology. Epistemic AI that deals with a bioinformatics, and Singular, which is basically deals with a psychiatric help centered in New York City. And by necessity, obviously, Maxeller, which you'll hear in a second about. So what do we know? Decades ago, we basically were building various applications. We built payroll applications that relied on user interface that had some business logic, but it also relied on keeping many users happy, so concurrency control, making sure that the people didn't arbitrarily abuse the system, so security, and obviously, since systems failed, a safe way of recovery. There were also other applications. There were inventory applications. They too had some business logic and had some interface, but they needed the same kind of techniques and same kind of components, such as many users running simultaneously, hence concurrency control, some security mechanisms, and some recovery. And in fact, the same can be said about marketing, which it had its own user interface and its own business logic, but again, relied on concurrency control, security, and recovery mechanisms, just like the other three applications. And with that came the realization that today, we really don't want to recode everything, and we don't want to redesign everything, and we don't want to retest everything. What we really have is what's called a database system, and that database system supports concurrency control, namely many users, the necessary security protocols, and obviously the ability to recover. And on top of that, what we do is we build these smaller applications that involve the user interface for payroll and the inventory and marketing and their associated business logic. So what did we learn out of this? Over the decades, we learned that we have to take stock of our past achievements. We have to actually utilize the technology that we've built, but we really need to personalize the last mile, because the last mile is the individual being, the payroll application, the inventory application, and the marketing application. Well, this is old news, but what can we say about today? Well, years ago, not decades ago, but years ago, we learned that deep learners can help significantly. Jim just recently talked, this past talk, about how AI has subcomponents, and the Venn diagram of AI has a component called machine learning. And within that component, there's deep learners. So deep learners are the state of the art, and they are the tools that were used for processing clinical notes, for processing scientific texts, for processing medical diagnoses. But every one of these, we're retraining and redesigning and re-implementing these deep learners to support the applications. But we learned that, as in the database world, we can do better. So what we do nowadays is we take the BERT system, or similar like it, which is a bidirectional encoder representation for transformers. Big, lots of vocabulary. You should learn that deep learners like to be named after Sesame Street characters. So you take BERT, for example, and then you fine tune the system of BERT. You have the last tuning in order to support clinical BERT for clinical notes, science BERT for scientific texts, and med BERT for medical diagnoses. The same lesson is repeated over and over and over again. We should take stock of past achievements, but we should personalize the last mile, because the big last mile personalization, which is critical for deep learners, is what makes your application really fly. So what is the realization? The realization is that in order to personalize these applications, you need data. And bottom line is, data are everything. No data means no learning, means no AI. And since the world is revolving in this whole topic of AI and deep learners, you need the data. So how do you get this data? Well, one easy way is simply to buy it. As you will see in the discussion a little later on, you can buy from various feeds, including the feeds we bought, which is the Taiwanese National Health Information Insurance Research Database. It is a set of medical records that you can actually use to train your system and to use it for diagnosis. Another option is to borrow. You can simply scrape from reliable sources, and keyword is reliable sources, because there's a lot of sources that are less than reliable, and you can incorporate their data into your system. You can beg. In the medical world, it's called residence, but in a general sense, you can take human annotations, which can use create sample data, and that data you can actually utilize for your application. And since we like to keep the same letter, we could be beholden. If you build what is the application that everybody wants, all of a sudden, everybody wants to be part of it. So they'll make sure that you might have their data to be included. But if you can't buy, borrow, beg, or be beholden, you can say, never mind. Because as I told you, there is BERT, and BERT works well. And even though BERT may not be as fine-tuned, it still works reasonably well. So you can use prepackaged, pre-trained networks. But that is just an example, because what you really want is to use all the above. You want to buy, borrow, beg, and be beholden, as well as use the knowledge that we've gained in the pre-trained networks. So let me steal or paraphrase, and we will call it a tale of two industrial explorations, because what I will talk to you about now is how two industries are solving health tech IT problems and hopefully bringing a better healthcare to all of us. So the first tale is that of lifelong integration of disparate medical data. Now, we all would agree that if you have more information, if you have more history of a patient, if you have a better understanding of all their medical needs, one should be able to provide a better, more accurate, more personalized healthcare for that given patient. And in some cultures, as Jim mentioned, different cultures have different aspects. In some cultures and in some society, we've got a nationalized healthcare plan. And that national healthcare plan basically provides data that is generally integrated to some degree. We don't have that. So what we need to have is we need to be able to take all the data and combine it and have the entire medical team see the medical data, and therefore to provide you the best cooperative care that a team can provide based on your lifelong medical records. And that is what Invariant aims to do. And I will discuss that in a second. A second tale is that we all know that the doctor is never wrong, but it never hurts to have a helping hand. So with the premise that the doctor is never wrong, what was developed is a personalized prescription prediction system where it will help the doctor get a second opinion that is customized and personalized and best optimized for the given patient. So given a patient, given their history, and given an ailment that's prescribed by the doctor, McSeller developed a system that can actually suggest what's the likelihood of outcome for that medication, for that ailment, for that patient. Now, you should know a couple things. There was discussion of human in the loop. In Invariant, the goal is to provide the doctor with all the tools and all the knowledge and the comprehensive understanding and the history of the patient so that the patient can be given the best care by the practicing physicians. In McSeller, there is no attempt to, quote, obfuscate the doctor. The doctor is the one prescribing, the doctor is the one suggesting. What it is providing is an online personalized care for the individual, for the doctor to have the most knowledge that the doctor can have. So let's delve a little deeper. So we're going to talk about patient-centered care. And I'm going to talk about it in a step-by-step manner. So the first step is to collect and integrate all related medical history. Now, that may sound easy, but it isn't as easy as it sounds, because the truth of the matter is, if you have this one global system let's call it the invariant system, you need to be able to talk to all the various electronic medical records that the patient has visited. And as you know, even the same hospitals have different medical records and the same organizations. And now when you start talking about visiting by a patient that moved from city to city, from hospital to hospital, from environment to environment, clearly their medical record is significantly fragmented. But that's only a minor problem, because in reality, that's only provides you the medical records you get from the doctor, but you're not always at the doctor. However, you are typically fit or measured by things like Fitbits and various monitors and Apple Watches. And those provide you the day-to-day, hour-to-hour information of the patient, which can obviously give you a much better, cleaner picture than the once in a month or once in the 6 months or once in a year visit to the medical doctor that is treating you. But why stop there? You can go to the many urgent care clinics that are scattered all over the place, and then you're completely separated from the EMRs of the medical doctors. You can also have various different Internet of Health, Internet of Things across the network. Not to mention the various drugs and pharmaceuticals and everything that from the life sciences, or the various different genomes and metabomes and et cetera along the way, all the multi-omics. Now, if you could ideally integrate all those, that would be very useful and very helpful, except it assumes one very important factor that isn't still provided, and that is that the patient is willing to interact with the doctors that is willing to provide, that is out to give them the patient care. And the way that's done is in order for the patient to feel comfortable. No one likes going to the doctor. No one likes waiting in line. No one likes filling out forms. No one likes to be, quote, sitting in a waiting room, waiting for treatment. They wish to be treated with sincerity, and they wish to be treated in comfort. And the way that people feel very comfortable nowadays is playing games. So the question is, can you play games to enter the healthcare? Can you make the patient feel comfortable by entering the healthcare? And the solution is by a chain of bots. I'm going to read it for you, but of course it can have conversations. But for the sake of the presentation, we'll just show you the bots and read as they project. So this is Inara. And Inara is there. I'm here to help you. I will never judge you, correct you, or talk down to you. I'm here to give you information that will help your experience and ensure it's safe and rewarding, not scary, judgmental, or a bunch of medical jargon. I have your back, and we will figure it out together, okay? So let me introduce my personalities. I speak doctor. Let me know what you want and to tell, and I'm on it. If you feel bad, just let me know. Anything that is bothering you is important to me. Need to see someone? I'm on it. Let's get the appointment set stress-free. And as we heard in the introduction, I'm always looking out for you. If I learn something new, I will let you know and explain why it's important. So now that the patient's in the system, now that that all the medical data is integrated, how can a doctor actually utilize it? And the way the doctor should utilize it is to provide an integrated and coordinated care environment. Now, when you start talking about integrated and coordinated, you could have all the patients and all the doctors in one clinic, but then that's very rare, and you have to coordinate time, and you have to coordinate all the expertise and the like. Or you can talk about telemedicine. Okay, telemedicine used to be a scary word, used to be a word that brought in a conflict and fear or resentment. That was before March of 2020, when we were all faced with the pandemic. In March of 2020, based on a survey of 2,000 patients, only 20% of them had actually personally experienced telemedicine. A year later, about 61% had experienced it. But more importantly, before the pandemic, only 44% believed that there's any chance that you could have an equivalent care level via telemedicine as you could with the doctor in person. That's not quite so after a year thereafter, which about 80% felt that the quality of care is almost equivalent or equivalent to that of an in-person visit. Prior to the pandemic, 65% doubted the quality of care at all of telemedicine, whereas in a year later, 88% wish to continue such abilities in the post-COVID era. So what can they provide you with telemedicine? First of all, you don't have to drive anywhere. You don't have to be exposed to various illnesses in the patient's waiting room. You don't have to be sitting in the traffic to get there. You don't have a problem coordinating. What it does also provide you is potentially higher quality. What it does is it lets you, the patient, interact with all your caregiving team, which are billing simultaneously, with all the various different doctors, your general practitioner, your cardiologist, et cetera, and they all interact with you while seeing your complete medical record and interact with themselves and each other to help provide you the best and most comprehensive care simultaneously in real time. So what it's doing is it's equating access to all, and this is particularly so in rural environments, while improving the quality for all. And when one does do some lab work, one should have the lab work available to all. And in fact, through the invariant system, when some results are taken care of and some labs are made or some diagnoses are made, it immediately goes to the gateway and is disseminated to all your care. So whenever you actually interact, they will see the same result. There's no need to take the same test over and over and over again. Unnecessary treatments, unnecessary tests that are not helpful in any way. So that's the integration of a lifelong medical record and a coordinated medical care team. But we can and should do more. We should be able to customize and personalize your effort. So based on an effort that was designed, developed, and eventually patented at Georgetown University, with the help of a medical hospital in Taiwan, using Taiwanese medical records, we developed a system that was licensed to Maxellar Technology, now called GHUCCTS. It was Maxellar was recently purchased by a real-time AI high-performance computing system company. And Maxellar Technology implemented and built a ruggedized approach to this prescription prediction and deployed it in GHUCCTS in Europe, which of course is then disseminated to other European countries and places. So what did they do? What did we do? We took your patient records, which describe your visits to the doctor and describes your diagnoses, describes your drugs. We mapped it on to a patient graph. So every patient has their entire lifelong medical history mapped onto a patient graph and representing their existence. And then when you come in to a doctor, the doctor pulls up your patient graph and says, it seems like you have some kind of ailment, let's say urinary tract infection, and I've got a set of possible medications to give you. What is most likely to succeed in you? Well, what's most likely to succeed is the same successful medication that was given to a patient just like you. So let's say you mapped onto a female patient who is 67 years of age, and you were diagnosed with bacterial pneumonia, and they were given the regimen of these medications. Well, unfortunately, 3 days later, you still had it. So apparently the treatment was not very good, so we shouldn't give it to you. But maybe you mapped onto a patient that's male and 71 that also had the same diagnosis as you do, but it was treated with that medication. And after 90 days, you were still fine. You didn't come back. So that's likely to succeed. And that's what we should prescribe. So the secret sauce to health tech technology and to deployment is to move it to industry by licensing and by development, to take and create fully integrated lifelong medical records, either virtually, such as done there, or by taking it, such as purchased from Taiwan. Take that, add some more intelligence into the mix by diagnosing the potential treatment plans, and hopefully in combination between the medical records, the coordinated care, and the guidance to the doctor, you'll be treated successfully and providing a gold standard of medical care. I was told that I should speak no longer than 20 minutes, or roughly 20 minutes. I've now spoken 19 minutes and 45 seconds. And with that, I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Frieder. Dr. Casebeer, if you are ready to turn on your camera, and you will be our second speaker in the panel. If you have questions, be sure to put them in the Q&A so we can run our Q&A session at the end of the panel. Thank you, Dr. Casebeer.
All right, thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate the kind introduction. Let me go ahead and go full screen here so you can see my slides. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Yep, that looks good, Bill.
All right, fantastic. Thanks so much, Dr. Vitone, for the kind introduction. It's really a pleasure to be on a panel with Dr. Frieder and to follow Dr. Giordano, and also to prepare to hear from Dr. Dios, all valued friends and colleagues. I will discuss in my 20 minutes of remarks the very idea of using artificial intelligence to assist us all in making more morally praiseworthy ethical decisions. So in other words, I'll talk about the concept of building an artificial conscience. That it really is kind of a follow-on to Dr. Giordano's talk, which was about the international ethical dimensions of advancements in AI. And so I just want to discuss the prospects for morally autonomous AI and how we as clinicians and practitioners can contribute to making sure that an artificial conscience is built in the proper way, in the way that can help us make better decisions. So in order to do that, I'll cover 5 topics in my 20 minutes. First, I'll talk a little bit about what an artificial conscience is. So that involves doing both some AI and some moral psychology. Second, I will talk about why we would want to build an artificial conscience. And a lot of my examples and reasons are actually going to come from the competitive context that Dr. Giordano mentioned in his keynote. So I'll talk some about the Department of Defense's interest in building an artificial conscience that might help regulate affairs on a battlefield, for instance. So once I've motivated the project, then I'll go more into the technology of AI. How would we actually build or train an artificial conscience? So I'll just gesture briefly at how that might happen. Next, and what will probably be occurring to many of you as we have this discussion, is there are obviously some concerns as we build an artificial conscience. Whose justice and which rationality are we going to build into it? So I'll talk about those concerns and how we can mitigate them. Finally, I'll just remind us all about how an empirical examination of how we all reason morally is important to help us tutor or build a useful artificial conscience. And so that means that these aren't just abstract issues for us. These all bottom out in lessons we can learn from connections to our clinical practice. So with that, let's hop into the very first topic. What is an artificial conscience? So I view something like an artificial conscience, or an archon, from the Greek arche for ruler, as a decision aid for human-in-the-loop systems. It's a critical faculty, especially for entirely autonomous systems, like some set of semi-autonomous medical advice and decision-making systems that might be constructed, like Ophir just talked about. So it's a decision aid that can help you and I make better decisions, more morally praiseworthy decisions. And it's a critical faculty that our autonomous systems, our AI systems that are working semi-independently from us, will need. So in that regard, it has to embody some combination of the four things that moral psychologist Jim Rest talks about in his body of work. And Dr. Rest passed away many years ago, but he's been an inspiration to me as I thought about things like comprehensive approaches to moral psychology. And so Dr. Rest points out that really, if we're to act morally, there are four kinds of capacities we have to have. First, we have to know that there are moral issues at stake. So we can call that moral sensitivity. Like maybe that the action I'm taking might harm someone, which immediately makes it an action with a moral dimension. So first is moral sensitivity. Second is moral judgment. We have to know, given all the things we should be morally sensitive to, how to adjudicate or balance the various principles that might inform our decision or potentially even come into conflict when we're making a difficult moral decision. Then third, we have to be motivated to act on that outcome of our moral judgment. So we may experience, for example, what Aristotle and Plato would call akrasia, or weakness of the will. We may do the wrong thing knowing full well it's the wrong thing because we can't overcome a desire we have to say, have that next beer, even though we shouldn't. Finally, fourth, and this is often neglected, we have to have the right set of skills that allow us to take the moral action that our judgment has recommended. And those can be both obvious skills, like the ability to explain our decisions to others, to morally justify them, so we can convince others they ought to do the right thing as well. And they might be less obvious. They might, for example, be informed by empirical social psychology, some understanding, for example, of how the various features of our environment interact with our human natures to drive our actions, so that I can understand that if I want to, say, reduce the amount of cheating that's happening in my college or university, then I might want to ensure that my students are getting enough sleep, because there's a pretty direct relationship between the likelihood that a student will make a bad judgment linked to cheating on a test and to them being under-rested for a couple of days before that decision. So we can then really take those four combinations of moral dimensions, and especially on the judgment side, shoot them through, if you will, with the principles of reason that are embodied in traditional moral theory. So some of you might have taken an ethics or philosophy class in your undergraduate education, or when you were studying nursing and took a course in applied ethics. And the mnemonic that I use to remind us about some of the general theories and principles we discussed in those courses, and that makes sense if you reflect on them, is what I call the 3 C's. So those are the 3 C's of character, consent, and consequence. That captures the fact that in most morally loaded situations, there's really an agent doing something to someone else. So 2 agents and an action. And character, consent, and consequence remind us that those are critical axes of evaluation as we look over the entirety of that circumstance. Character asks us to evaluate the habits and dispositions of the first agent, the agent taking the action, for example, and the impact of those actions on the characters, habits, and dispositions of others, such that we flourish or embody the right kinds of dispositions that will help us realize our functional natures. So what I just gave you there was a 10-second warmed over description of the moral philosophies of Aristotle and Plato, the ancient Greek theorists, and arguably also the moral philosophies from Confucian ethics in China. The second C is consent. That's the doing something. And some actions by their very nature run roughshod over the idea that I have a right not to be treated in a certain way, for instance. There are certain things you can't do to me without my consent. So this is called the Deontic Tradition, from the Greek deon, for respect for duties. And our exemplar here is somebody like the Prussian philosopher Immanuel Kant, who talked about the importance of consent and the importance of acting on principles that I can universalize, principles that I can ask all consenting creatures reasonably to consent to. Finally, third, my actions have an impact on other agents and on the environment. Those are the consequences of the action. This is good old-fashioned utilitarian reasoning. Your exemplars here, if you think back to that philosophy or applied ethics course, are folks like Jeremy Bentham or John Stuart Mill, a very common sense approach to ethics, which says that those actions are ethical, which produced the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of creatures capable of experiencing happiness, of sentient creatures. So our Archon, if it's going to focus especially on the judgment dimension of those four things our autonomous system needs to possess to reason and act morally, should really think of these three C's at the very least, of character, consent, and consequence. So that gives you some idea of what an artificial conscience is. It would be a system that's a decision aid for us, or that sets on our autonomous teammates, robots, etc., that can help drive their actions towards morally praiseworthy ones. So let's move now quickly to why we might want to build such a thing. So I will focus here on the defense context, since, as Jim mentioned, it's sometimes competition between nations that defines innovation. And there are a lot of thorny ethical issues that come up in national security and defense-related contexts. I'm a retired Air Force intelligence officer, so some of these examples come to mind immediately for me. So if I default to those, do keep in mind that even though I might use the defense context to justify building an artificial conscience, the points I will make really have broader applicability across all domains, not just domains where autonomy is used for national security. So there are four reasons, I think, at least in the defense context, why we ought to build an Archon. First of all, I think that autonomy is inevitable. That is that in a national security context, competition will drive nation states and non-state actors to use artificial intelligence to generate new national security related capabilities. We're already doing that now. We've been doing it for over 20 years. That ranges over everything from really what are almost entirely autonomous unmanned aerial vehicles or remotely piloted vehicles, through to what is called autonomy at rest. So decision assistants that do things like advise whether or not a certain object in full motion video or a photograph is in a permitted target class so that you can drop a bomb on it, automated target recognition algorithm systems. So those things are already being fielded. And I think that as AI develops more in capability, using things like BERT and GPT on the natural language processing front that Ophir mentioned earlier, that those technologies will be integrated into our national security apparatus. So I think we need to get ahead of the ball and start to think about how we can integrate an artificial conscience into some of those systems so that we can regulate the behavior of those systems so they don't do things autonomously that we're not proud of. Second, our military doctrine that we've built already requires that we think about building an artificial conscience. So if you look at the foundational research documents of places like the Army or the US Navy, the idea of building systems that can govern and regulate the parts of the national defense technology community that are autonomous, those needs and requirements have been identified. So our decision makers are attempting to get ahead of the ball. They realize that our foundational research and development requirements require it. They demand that we think about building systems that we can live with using on the battlefield. Third, I think the competitive nature of national security technology acts as a driver here. And I believe that if we don't act early to build an artificial conscience into our AI systems that are used for national security, that our failure to do so means adversaries that don't share our same scruples, our same way of life, our same respect for certain universal human rights, could exploit our high visibility failure to do so, to prevail on the battlefield. We already see this happening. So we have seen, for instance, in Afghanistan and in the second Iraq War, where ISIS or the Taliban have planted artificial indiscriminate actions on the battlefield and then blamed those indiscriminate actions, the death of innocents, on Allied forces, even when Allied forces weren't responsible for those deaths. And that's an attempt to exploit this dynamic where, as Gil and Ariel Sharon talked about, one of the surest ways to get a democracy to back away from a war is to cause the democracy to overreach when it comes to prosecuting it, so that eventually support for the war is hollowed out at home and we retreat in strategic failure. So I think the competitive nature of national security technology acts as a driver here for the fielding of autonomy, and that we need to build an artificial conscience to forestall or prevent some catastrophic failure or some created contextual failure on the battlefield that an adversary might put forth. Finally, and last, I think that morality simply demands it. I think if we want to be good people, that we ought to regulate our technologies in the appropriate ways. And for those technologies that are serving our ends, that are acting autonomously or semi-autonomously, we need to give them the capacity to self-regulate so that we don't always have to be there when they're unobserved to micromanage every decision or action that they are making or taking. So hopefully that has motivated some why we might want to build an artificial conscience. And as we build that archon, it's useful as we now switch to the topic of thinking about how we might engineer such a system, that we keep in mind how our own brains have engineered our judgment and deliberation faculties. And here it's useful to think about things like the huge research program in heuristics and biases. So heuristics and biases consist, as many of you know, in the study of how our brain takes shortcuts in some cases to reach judgments or conclusions. And there's a really lovely diagram in Wikipedia that I'm showing you now called the Cognitive Bias Codex. It's not an academic document, but it's a nice summary of the hundreds of types of heuristics and biases, shortcuts in cognition that have been studied by psychologists, cognitive scientists, and neuroscientists. They really can be broken into 4 different classes. So in the upper left-hand corner, you can see those shortcuts we might take that are related to the important question of what should we remember? As I'm about to make a decision now, what should I bother to recall? Sometimes when we make those decisions, we're under time pressure to act. So in the bottom left of this diagram, you can see there are a whole slew of biases affiliated with our need to act quickly, since we're often under time stress or pressure. Now, when we're taking those actions, we often confront an environment at the top right where we have too much information. It's difficult to know what is relevant or salient, and we have to cut through the clutter so as to make a decision. Finally, because there's something called the paucity of the stimulus, as Noam Chomsky talked about, oftentimes the things that we see in our environment don't come with enough meaning built in such that an obvious solution to the problem we're confronting faces itself. So that final set of biases or heuristics focuses on our need to import meaning into the stimulus so we know how to act. So these 4 examples of cognitive biases are things that we need to take into account of whenever we build an artificial conscience, because depending on whether or not these are what are called ecologically valid or adaptive, we want to make sure that we use these shortcuts whenever we're engaging in moral judgment and deliberation. On the other hand, if the heuristic is too much of a shortcut and is ecologically invalid, it doesn't work for the current context, and it's really more of a bias that we want to eliminate, then we need to be sure that we don't build that bias in to our AI algorithms that might be thinking about ethical issues. So this gets back to the notion that a couple of our speakers have raised of bias in AI and bias in training sets for those AIs that are taught rather than programmed. So getting into a discussion of heuristics and biases in all their glory, I think they're really important topic is beyond the time we have here, but understanding those heuristics and biases is going to be important as we seek to engineer an artificial conscience. Because if you think about those 4 pieces of the architecture of an artificial conscience that we have to build, remember moral sensitivity, moral judgment, moral motivation, and moral skill, we're going to have to think about whether or not we build in some shortcuts on those fronts, some adaptive heuristics. And while I think we do need to use those 3 C's of character, consent, and consequence, reaching back to Aristotle, Plato, Kant, and Mill as our foundation, that there are going to be circumstances where we'll need our AIs, just like we need our people, to make a quick decision. And in those cases, we want our heuristics to be adaptive, and we want our study of human moral cognition to inform what is the most effective way to act in those difficult circumstances. So as a couple of our speakers have mentioned, in next wave AI, we often don't talk about coding in AI so much as we do talk about training an artificial intelligence. So if you ever hear anybody talk about a train, tune, test pipeline, they're talking about something like taking a deep learning network that has a bunch of nodes with weights between them that can be adjusted and exposing it to certain kinds of data, having inside of that network a learning algorithm built in that can let it adjust the connections between those nodes so that when it's presented with new data, it can perform an inference, and out of the back of that network can pop a recommendation for an action or a judgment. So that's what I mean by training an artificial conscience rather than hand coding it or using traditional, what are called symbolic programming methods to build in those 3 C's into the judgment system. So really there are 3 different possibilities in how we would build an artificial conscience, way beyond the time we have to discuss here today, but just so you can know about them. We could think about an emergent artificial conscience where we focus on some lower level capabilities or techniques that might lead to an emergent decision-making apparatus that can respect the demands of ethics. Second, we could think about using traditional symbolic approaches, as I just mentioned. There are lots of ways in traditional AI that we think about reasoning in uncertain circumstances. We could use formal logic, the first order predicate calculus. You could use fuzzy logic, where you relax some of those assumptions. You could use modal logic. That's a type of logic that deals with possible worlds, like what if I were to act in a certain way? What would the impact of that action be? We could use deontic logic. So that's a type of logic that was actually built to deal with universal principles in human rights and think about the interaction of certain invaluable principles like respect for human rights as we think about what we ought to do. But the third approach that I mentioned that I'll talk about now, and one that I favor, would be to actually use neural networks and something like deep learning to build an artificial conscience. These are more biologically realistic approaches, and they allow us to train an algorithm, especially if we use an unbiased data set, to make some decisions that truly can be useful to me as I, human honor in the loop, try to make a better moral judgment. And it means that those things that we all study as clinicians become very important as we use that biologically realistic training-oriented approach. Okay, in my last couple of minutes here, since I'm going to do my best to make the 20 minutes also, let's deal with some concerns and rejoinders before talking about connection to clinical practice. First, you might say, this is a great idea, Bill, but we've got a problem. What values are we going to build into this network? Or as Alistair McIntyre puts it, whose justice and which rationality should we consider? But note that this really isn't a unique question. We already face this question with humans in the loop. That's why we have philosophy classes. That's why we do ethics training and education. So this is not a question that's unique to AI. It's a question that we all face. And I think we would need a transparent and democratic process to help us think about whose justice, which rationality, and what values we build into these archons. And something like what Philip Kitcher recommends for regulating the conduct of science in general would be useful to think about here. Second, you might say, Bill, this is all a misguided enterprise. What you propose is not possible, either by definition or just as a matter of empirical fact. Now, I would say if this is true, if you think that moral judgment comes down to us from the ether, well, then there's a sense in which really you have nothing to fear by engaging in this engineering project, because our AIs will never be able to engage in moral reasoning on that assumption. But I think really that those objections reflect outdated assumptions about the nature of cognition, something called the computational representational theory of thought, that's really been under attack in cognitive science and in the success of deep learning as an approach in general. I would also note that we are already building artificial decision aids based on some assumptions about the nature of morality. For example, while I was at Lockheed Martin, I built a decision aid that when it noticed a pilot was about to drive an airplane into a ground, pilots are so dedicated to their mission that they can become task fixated and not notice that they're about to drive an airplane into the ground. That decision aid would observe that was about to happen, would step in, take over the controls of the airplane, bring it to straight and level flight, and then turn things back over to the pilot. That was really a baby artificial conscience. It realized that there was about to be harm done to a human and that there was an action it could take. It was motivated to take it. It had the skill to take it because it could take over the flight controls momentarily. And there are at least 7 people walking the earth today who are alive because of the actions of an archon. Finally, you might say, look, we can't really trust AI and there's not enough transparency in this process of building an ethical AI, so we need to reject them. And I agree that we probably should bias our research method towards methods that have transparency built in so that we can understand why our trained artificial con-shy are making the decisions they're making. And I think that with proper design, education, and actual use, you can build a trustworthy AI, just like we have built a trustworthy ground collision avoidance system that's used in the F-22 and F-35 fight platforms. Finally, and as I exit stage right here, just keep in mind that all of you, all of us, if we have clinical dimensions to what we do each day, that our work that we do in clinical practice is going to inform the development of an artificial conscience. And artificial conscience almost certainly must replicate how people who exhibit good moral judgment reason and act. We know that people are imperfect, that people exhibit pathologies in judgment, both major and minor. We'll need to understand those and research those. We'll need to understand them in the clinical context if we're going to build the type of system that Ophira, for example, talked about earlier. And sometimes those relationships between our environments and our actions exist in what's called the space of reasons, not causes. That is, they're not necessarily intuitive. For example, you might not think that the temperature of a cup that you're holding could influence your judgment of another person. But we know that it can, because warm cups can influence the balance between your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system in such a way that you go into rest and digest mode, which causes your brain to produce certain types of social chemicals that are useful for bonding and relaxation, and that can cause you to rate someone more highly during a job interview. That's in the space of causes. And those relationships are not necessarily intuitive, ones we need to explore in the clinical domain. So your teams ultimately are crucial for helping us understand when our own moral faculties are well adapted, when they are not, what parts of the clinical environment can cause them to go astray. And in that sense, things like Tony Damasio and his seminal and groundbreaking work in gambling pathologies with the Iowa gambling task, or the study of both good judgment and pathological judgment can be instrumental in helping us train an AI to replicate good judgments, but not bad ones. So in the last 22 minutes, I've spoken with you about an Archon, what it is, why we want to build it, how we do so, some concerns we might have as we do so, and the important role that you all have to play as clinicians in helping us do this in an intelligent and morally praiseworthy fashion. I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Very thoughtful and very additive to the previous two speakers. And I look forward now to Dr. DeIuliis taking over our, there she is, taking over our screen and closing out this panel. Thank you, Dr. DeIuliis.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And I hope you can hear me okay. Well, it's always hard. I feel like when you're the last speaker in the session after this such tour de force talks by Jim and the previous two speakers in this session, my colleague, Bill Caspear. It's great to enjoy those sessions and just fantastic. So many of the issues that are brought up. I'm going to change gears just a little bit. And the title of my talk today is called The Intersection of AI and Biotechnology. As was mentioned at the beginning, one of the things I work on at National Defense University is emerging biotechnologies, not only for the benefits for that it can be used for the Department of Defense, which are moving faster and faster all the time, but also looking at where the security aspects lie, what are the ethical issues, and what risks might be associated with biosecurity in that space of AI. So, okay, we always start with the bottom line up front, which is, of course, I'm going to say that AI offers tremendous potential to advance many different areas within biotechnology and within biotechnology sectors. And by biotechnology, by the way, I'm speaking biotechnology writ large, not just pharma and medicine, which I think everyone is well familiar with, but the extension of biotechnology to many different fields like energy, fuels, materials, agriculture, things like that. Biotechnology is sort of seamlessly imposing itself into many different sectors. And part of that is because of this intersection of the ability to use things like AI and machine learning and in an interface with biotechnology. So as this happens, as we see this convergence of information technology and biotechnology, it can potentially lower bars to both traditional and emerging threats, but it also creates ethical dilemmas, as we have heard thus far today. So I wish that I could take Bill K-Spear's talk and approach and expand that to everyone who wants to do cool things with biotech, because he asked all the right questions. What are the risks involved? How should we do this? Not just, I want to do this cool thing because this is my goal at the end, but really asking the question of how. I think Bill gave a great example of what my idea of biosecurity by design looks like, and I'm going to talk more about that. So I want to talk about why we need risk assessment frameworks on the front end of biotechnology and AI endeavors, and then I want to describe this as a biosecurity by design approach that we should be applying writ large to many emerging technologies, not just at the AI piece. Okay, so some questions I want to start with is that data drives everything in this space. Jim Giordano and I have talked about biodata. Sometimes we talk about neurodata. There is genomic data. All different aspects of data are driving anything that can happen with AI. And I think Ophir gave a very nice diagram at the beginning of his talk saying, this is the data we have and this is the data that we need. So how do we think AI is going to be used and how it may evolve in future? We kind of need to look at that space. So when I talk about the data bins that are ripe for AI in biotechnology, I kind of divide them, and these are just my designations, but we need to have ways of thinking about the data, because in a biosecurity context, if we want anyone to prevent using the data for harm, we need to know what is the crucial data that needs protection versus data that may not need so much critical protection because, and rather we would like to share and make that data available because it advances the field. So I kind of talk about organisms data or biodata, if you like. And this is where we're doing research. We're doing biosurveillance. We're doing public health. We're cataloging and protecting diversity around the globe, the global virome, the global biodiversity programs. Let's sequence everything on the planet and learn about our ecology and biodiversity. Biodesigns for the bioeconomy. So all of those things I mentioned, making alternative fuels from biological organisms, making substitute leather from fungal cells, making alternative foods that taste like meat. All of these kinds of things are growing components of the bioeconomy that involve engineering of biology for creation of purposeful products. And of course, agriculture has long been in the biotech space. That is also evolving really rapidly in the modern era. I put human biological data in a separate category because all of the things you can do with organisms, there are some risks and threats there, which I'll talk about in a minute. But humans, there's a unique aspect of this data, right? It's not just privacy and identifying people anymore, which it has always been. But now we're talking about precision medicine and public health. We're talking about pharmaceutical products and the design of those products to individuals. And of course, human augmentation and performance, which is two areas that the Department of Defense is very interested in pursuing. And so are many of our allies and many of our adversaries. And lastly, we have to think about automation and AI and machine learning in the operational space. And this is a space that we forget about and it gets neglected because it kind of seamlessly underlies so many of the things that we take for granted more and more and more in our society. The data that's used in medical devices, cyber systems that are controlling the data for biological operations, platforms for biological manufacturing and the making of vaccines, association of data for standards that could be used across different components of healthcare or across different components of agriculture, right? So all of these different bins of data, you know, they're used differently, but they drive what you are able to do with machine learning and AI. So some of these benefits are we can do a much better precision gene editing. We can model and biodesign in silico. The first few prototypes for the COVID vaccine were modeled in silico based on the sequence of SARS-CoV-2. We couldn't have done that 2 decades ago, right? We have programs now that we are able to do biodesign in a real way. We could look at the physical operations of biotechnology, like platforms and autonomous laboratory facilities. We're doing drug discovery by using AI now, exploring chemical space, and I'll say more about that in a minute. And of course, personalized medicine and I think things that Ophir was getting at, improved accuracy in health and healthcare. So much that we could do there using AI. A quick reality check is AI is good as we would like it to be. And I will say right now, I am guilty of this, saying AI is going to be able to do all this cool stuff. Why aren't we doing it? And during, at the beginning of COVID, as a matter of fact, James Giordano and I wrote a small piece saying, we really think that our platforms for preparedness and response need to be modernized. And couldn't we be using AI and machine learning better? And here were some of the common, pitfalls is that there were a bunch of AI tools built to try and do good things during the COVID epidemic. And they were unable to do that for different reasons related to different user systems, different kinds of data, interoperability of the data, and so forth. But so it's very hard to do something in the middle of a pandemic and try and build that. It's reasoning for, we should be building these things when we're not in a pandemic, but they're going to get better. The models are going to get better. The data is going to get better. And we need to be prepared for how to secure the data and be ready for that. So where AI can create risks. Some of you may have seen this article that came out recently that many pharmaceutical companies are building models of AI and algorithms that can explore chemical space in better, faster ways than they could do prior to having these kinds of tools. And so they built this particular model was built, and some folks were looking at it and they said, hey, can we let's run all the testing of this to make sure it works the way we think it should work. And so, for example, they entered things that would give them expected drug profiles and expected druggable pathways for known things like tuberculosis or some other kinds of maladies that you say, okay, we're gonna search on these and see what comes out. And then they realized, gee, if we could be looking for druggable targets for beneficial pharmaceutical things, maybe this tool would reveal druggable pathways for not such great drugs like nerve agents. And indeed, that was the case. When they searched for particular nerve agents, when they searched for particular pathways activated by nerve agents, they were able to generate novel type of molecules that would activate those pathways. So again, great tool, great benefit, but someone built the tool before the realization that this tool could be used for the opposite thing of the goodness that I want to use it for. So just as we could design precision medicines using AI and awareness of people's genomes, we could design precision maladies, right? If we know about things that harm people, we can trigger those kinds of things with this type of knowledge base. So one of the, and also getting at the operational data, again, we can never forget to keep talking about operational data. As labs become more and more autonomous, they are open to hacking, right? And misuse of data in those platforms, right? So you think that you are calling up information on a particular patient, and that data is misrepresented purposefully, and you could potentially prescribe something for the patient that harms the patient rather than helps the patient. So that gets into a whole other world of autonomy. Again, how is the data being protected? How are we protecting it from misuse, hacking, things like that? One last thing I wanted to say on this slide is, so, when I research this space, I find that particularly in the pharmaceutical space, where pharmaceutical companies are looking to AI for exploring chemical space and automating their platforms and building better vaccines and all these different things. A huge chunk of this is spent on marketing. I don't work in the information space or the marketing space, but much of the tools of AI that many companies are using right now is about understanding their market and how to sell things. And I think certainly in the healthcare arena, there is some ethical fodder there for about these algorithms and how companies might be looking to sell things to folks. So I think I mentioned many of these thus far. This is just a slide kind of summarizing that, hacking data for its dual use potential. They're all the traditional things. People can make bioweapons using data. They can do harmful biodesign. They can come up with precision maladies. They can do cyber intrusions that cause kinetic harms or cyber intrusions that have harmful biological outcomes. So I've listed some of those there. And then I've added an additional box here because this is we aren't quite there yet, but someday we will be. And that is actually using biology as a form of communication, right? So people a lot smarter than me, Jim, Bill, can say more about this, but when we begin to use DNA molecules, other molecular entities, protein structure, and embed in those ways to communicate, what does that mean? And what does that mean for hacking and all the digital platforms that we are familiar with that are electronic? What happens when they become biological? So that's just kind of throwing it out there. I wanted to mention this study I was involved with because it didn't talk about AI in particular. It was a study about the bioeconomy, but it touched on the idea that data is driving a bioeconomy, this connection between information technology and biotechnology and all of the products that are coming out of that in this space. And we wanted to explore the data risks involved in that. And so we talked about some of the fundamental cybersecurity risks, and we talked about the cyber physical systems. We made 3 recommendations. One, just a simple, do good housekeeping, adopt best practices, protect from digital intrusion, exfiltration. That's like the no-brainer, right? And then we said, we really need to begin investing in better data, better curated data, modernized data, thinking back to why can't we use these chest x-rays for using AI during COVID? We need to have better data systems, better data itself, better curation, and better integrity of such databases. I think Ophir also showed some of the publicly available NIH databases, and not all data is equal. Many companies are building their own internal databases because they want them to have this high level of purity, so to speak, in case there is bad data in the public databases. So one of the recommendations we made, I've got a little check mark here because this one actually came true. We recommended that there be an information sharing and analysis center, or an ISAC. So in other words, there are ISACs about the electrical grid. There are ISACs about flying airplanes around the country. This would be an ISAC that would consider biological data as critical infrastructure, right? How do we protect this data moving forward? And so I can tell you now that the BioISAC is stood up and they have just started and they're really beginning to get their feet on the ground. So, I'm kind of closing out here to the end of my comments. And this is the slide I always show when I talk about biosecurity by design. And here I just want to say that I preach biosecurity design to life scientists, people who are doing dual use research, people who are working on pathogens with pandemic potential, right? People doing gain of function research, right? But I think the biosecurity by design principle applies to this space where AI is convergent with biotechnology. And so I think we need to do risk assessment frameworks, apply them to traditional research as well as the bioeconomy. We need to build communities of interest around this space, and we have to bring everybody into the tent, right? Just because you're an expert in AI, you know, someone who's an engineer is not an expert on ethics. They're not an expert on patient rights and, you know, clinical issues. They're trying to make a cool tool in a startup company out in Silicon Valley, right? So how do we get them thinking about biosecurity by design? And so I think from this, we can begin to build some best practices. Again, I can't emphasize enough how much I love that Bill Casebeer's slides said, how should we build this? How should we do it? What are all the things we need to think about? That's biosecurity by design. So I'm going to stop my comments there. Hopefully I didn't go over my 15-minute allotment, and I'll be very happy to take any of your questions or comments. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you so much.
How do I stop?
Dr.
Okay, there.
Danielius, yeah, if you'll just, thank you very much. So I'm going to ask our panelists now to camera on, so we'll come together and invite anyone in the audience who has a question for our panelists. This was a very important panel, and I just really appreciate the building of the content between the three of you and additive to Dr. Giordano's keynote. I don't see a comment in the Q&A, and we have just a few minutes, so I'm going to ask a question. One of the things that struck me being a bioethicist is how important the three of you touched on using our ethics and how using our normal ethics, even in these unusual ways, how to really build out from what we have. So I wonder if in your experience, you might suggest, are there places where our usual ethics are lacking and that we need to build out more broadly? There was a question previously about how would an IRB chair know whether or not the right questions were being asked? And it does beg the question, right? We have to be knowledgeable in a different way to know whether we've protected or protected against the harms. So I don't know who wants to give a first go at that. Bill, do you want to?
Sure, I can wade in. That's a great question, Sarah. Yeah, I do think that the self-same principles that we use to reason about ethics in ordinary circumstances generally also apply in extraordinary circumstances. It's just that what happens in an extraordinary circumstance is that some latent possible conflict between things that we value comes to a head, right? So when I think, for example, in the national security context of targeting decisions, right, I think of something like somebody who has to make a difficult choice about judging the uncertainty of the nature of the target they're going to strike, with the knowledge that striking that target, come what may bring an end to the war more quickly so that fewer people are harmed, right? And I think the exact same principles that would govern our decisions every day, like in general, innocent people have a right not to be killed, and in general, I ought not to formulate the intention to do harm to someone, apply there too. It's just that we have these tensions between utilitarian and thinking and deontic or rights-based thinking that are latent or present and don't come to a head in the easy circumstances. So I think the most difficult circumstances that we think as medical decision makers are probably around issues linked to privacy. Just because I think privacy is an integral human right, it's linked to the notion that I and not other people own my body. And the ramifications of regulatory decisions and data protection decisions often aren't apparent at the society and intra-society level until much later. You know, irrespective of what you think of somebody like Ed Snowden, you know, Snowden's revelations that our own intelligence agencies were often involved in dragnet collection against communications that we all as citizens thought were private, you know, is important to consider. And that's an example where this latent issue suddenly became important because of the intersection of technology and everyday ethics.
Absolutely.
Let me try to answer the question. And the reason I jump in is that obviously my background is different from the three other speakers. And I interact heavily with lawyers. And because I interact heavily with lawyers, the first thing I learned, or the first thing I was taught, is answer the question you want to answer, not the question you were asked. So I'm going to answer the question I want to answer and not the question you posed. And the question of ethics relates to, you have to understand the questions you're actually asking and what the data source you're actually dealing with. And the reason I say that is if I want to do economic forecasting and I want to collect data, because AI is prediction, right? So I want to collect data, train the data, and train the system. And I end up saying, okay, I'll collect data from say a credit card company, from MasterCard or from Visa or so on and so forth. Well, I'm going to get a great answer that works wonderfully for those who have the credit cards. But those that don't have credit cards because they have a bad credit history, they're not going to appear. So my answers are going to look fantastic when it comes to it. If I collect medical data and I want to use the medical data and I get information from those that basically go to clinical studies, I'm already biasing my answer based on those that actually went to clinical studies. The ones that were rejected for various reasons or didn't have access for various reasons do not participate. So when you talk about ethics, bioethics, medical ethics, and so on and so forth, you have to understand that when you deal with AI, you have to actually know what you're actually showing and what you're actually getting and what you're actually prescribing. And that relates to the data that you have. And this is true across the board. The best example that people often tout is when they developed seat belts. The models that they used were all based on the male subjects that they had. Difference is the males were actually bigger than the typical female, and therefore the seat belts choked them. So you have to understand what the data is, and more importantly, what data you're selecting to answer your question. So there, now that I answered a completely different question, it dealt with ethics nonetheless.
Although I wasn't actually part of the panel, let me jump in two ways. Number one, let me refute Bill Casebeer's modesty, right? You know, he mentioned the 3 C's. And when Bill was the program manager of the early phases of the DARPA programs that engaged the lion's share of the first and second year funding of the BRAIN initiative, what he did is he stood up an LC panel. An LC advisory panel, ethical, legal, and social issues advisory panel that was proactive in addressing the ethical landscape, these new technologies, both in their current iteration and in their developmental trajectories, would engage and what those issues were. And of course, a lot of what we were doing back then, this is back in 2013, was engaging big data and AI as force multipliers for the brain sciences. And that was critical to Bill's approach. So great that, number one, Bill jumped on that question because he really was, quote, the modeler. He was the cornerstone setter for that. And then in the interim, a question came up from Marielle about marginalized groups. And I want to address that very, very quickly, and I'll pass it over to my colleagues on the panel. There are efforts in this space. I mean, at the intersection primarily of technologies and how those interface, for example, with not only developed nations, but marginalized populations within developed nations, then ultimately developing and non-developed nations as well, with regard to these global balances of power and asymmetries and capability. So the 2 major efforts that have been underway was one that was started by UNESCO, which is the data and artificial intelligence movement towards diversified populations. And then the other one that was founded by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development towards economic cooperation and development of programs and projects that embraced some form of mini-max or maxi-min. In other words, engaging the necessary steps so that those who had minimum access to these things would be provided with maximum resources in their utility. And those things are important. But one of the key maxims that's going to be necessary in that is one that you've heard in the research literature and verbiage often, and I think really needs to be sustained. Nothing about us without us, which then really prompts a need for a lot of what we're doing, which is that outreach and education and training across a variety of diverse populations, inclusive those who are characteristically and historically underserved, in AI, big data, and systems modeling, so as to be able to be participatory in the discourse. Over to you guys.
Dr. DeIuliis, did you want to comment?
I don't, as a non-clinician, I don't have too much to add to what's already been said, but I will say that I love the last, I actually just wrote it down, Jim, where Jim said, nothing about us without us. I love that statement, and it made me think of the NIH Genomic Project, which is called All of Us, but really they've only captured people who are sort of willing to volunteer their information and be part of that program. Others who do not, but their data exists in other places that could be being used in the same way. So I found that quite interesting. The other thing I would say is that one thing that's outside the clinical space, but that again is a growing trend as this bioeconomy grows, is that we are adding an extra E on to ELSI. So we're talking about ethical, legal, social, and environmental issues, because many of the things that we're creating through biology, whether it's creating novel vaccines from mRNA, or whether we're creating vanilla in sort of cell-free modified DNA systems, whatever they may be on biological manufacturing platforms, they all there are things that can be deployed into environments, things that people will consume inside their bodies, like foods and flavorings and all these other things. And they may not be like taking a drug, but they're going to be used by humans, and they're going to be out in the environment, right? They're going to be, in water systems, they're going to be excreted, they're going to be used in environments, they're going to be used on plants and in the soil. So it's broadened on our lens of ethics by that much to add environments to it. Thanks.
One of the things that our CTSAs across the city have been really thinking about, and to the question about how vulnerable populations or marginalized populations are brought into the development, either in the in the design or application, is how do we be confident that the design has been inclusive, and then how the AI or machine learning is being used to address even culturally relevant learning. And I love the comments about deep learning, how that is developed. So any thoughts about that? And maybe specifically, I was thinking during the presentation, would it be possible to have AI or machine learning that might target, protecting against bias or against risks in a way that maybe what we're seeing is sort of, I don't know, front or downstream, and maybe what we need to look is in the opposite direction. So any thoughts there? Yeah, Bill?
Yeah, I can jump in, Sarah. That's a great question. And thanks also to Mariel and others in the comments for talking about the diversity issue. Model bias is so important to consider, both in the data that you use to train the model and the architectural decisions you make in deep learning that are going to influence what representations the network comes to develop over training time, and in how the network is deployed while used for inference, in its circumstance. All of those things are shot through with bias. So, I keep here in the back as a reminder to me, a famous book in human factors called by Dreyfus Associates, called The Measure of Man and Woman. It's an inspiration on the one hand because it reminds us that we need to quantify things if we want to engineer against them. But it's also a reminder of model bias, right? Because if you think there are only two genders in the world, you got another thing coming, right? So this book is already biased from the get-go in the title and the two illustrations it chooses to be illustrative. So we need to keep that bias in design in mind when we do ethical design. And one of the best ways to prevent bias, I think, is to get every possible stakeholder is going to be influenced by your decision, or in the case of technology development, your technology around the table at the beginning. So as the chief science advisor for Beyond Conflict, where we use cognitive science to try to reduce the likelihood of conflict between groups, one of the first things we do when we do a science-informed design intervention is to say, who will be impacted by this intervention and where are their representatives? And guess what? In some cases, that includes people who you might otherwise think of as adversaries. And so that conversation has to be broad and general. Otherwise, you probably will be building something that might be praiseworthy, but also extremely biased.
Thank you, Bill. Just as you were speaking to that, I started to think about, you know, as all of you have been involved in industry and other areas, and we're getting ready to have a great panel specific to that. In all of the organizations that you're working with, how does ethics get applied? Do you count on a scientist who might have an ethics training or an ethics interest? And are you seeing it more broadly identified as a specific need for around the table? How is that being addressed, or has it changed over your career?
It needs to be addressed earlier on. I deal with technology development. When you get to where you get to me, that answer has already been dealt with, in the sense that if I'm given a set of training data and a architecture, or told go model an architecture, that's already too late. Because when you talk about AI, you really talk about nowadays, and particularly in deep learning, the ability to explain what you're doing, or explainable AI. And quite honestly, I don't care how much you talk about attention networks and so on and so forth. The level of understandability is still limited. It is still a black box. And therefore, if you're dealing with trying to diagnose a post effect, it's too late. You need to be able to have a discussion on ethics way early and decide the right data sets. So you don't have the MasterCard for the representation of the purchases, and you don't have the patients who actually signed up to the clinical trials as the data set, and you don't have the ones who are from the affluent hospitals as their data sets. You have a right balance. And balance, by the way, is also dangerous, because if you want an easy classification, you just always answer the majority answer. So the majority answer is always going to be likely to get you the highest metrics. So what you need to make sure is that you've dealt with the data sets and the metrics you're going to use to evaluate it, and the error function you're going to use to train it, way before you get to somebody like me that actually starts running it. So at least when it comes to me, I'm not saying that I'm excused, clearly not, but if it's relying on somebody like me, then you've already passed the buck way too far down the food chain.
I appreciate that. And I'll just comment that yesterday, the Research Ethics Consortium members for the CTSIs had a similar conversation, and it is becoming more pressed in our field to be involved earlier. The question is it valued by these different companies, and where can we get a step in? We have about 2 minutes. Bill or Diane, would you like to comment on that?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question again? I was going to say something in response to what Ophir had said, which is I agree 100% with him. And I was going to add that just to tack on to that previous question a little bit. At DoD, we are taking the ethical issues quite seriously. So there is, within the Research and Engineering Directorate, there is a biotechnology community of interest, which it's not focused on AI per se, although there is an AI modernization effort going on at DoD. But within the biotechnology community of interest, where we're talking about human performance, human augmentation, and how, the idea that all of this data that would be collected on devices, for example, that warfighters would wear, and all of the data that can be learned from pilots in the cockpit, all of these different things, medical data that's being taken from them, and then using that data to learn about how to enhance performance and things like that. We are doing some ethical studies. We just completed one, but unfortunately it's only a within DoD distribution right now. But the point is, we've convened many community of experts, including people like Jim and others, to give advice on these ethical issues because they're so important. But could you repeat the other question? Because I was thinking about that and I didn't quite get it.
No, that's perfect. And I'm going to let Bill take the last question. There's a question in our Q&A and Bill has an answer for that. So if you would read the question for me, Bill.
Yeah, it's a question from Marielle that says, if AI not only replicates human biases, but it confers on these biases a kind of scientific credibility, why do you think there's the belief that AI has an objective status? My answer is that, yeah, I agree that sometimes people confuse the opacity of AI with thinking that deep learning is literal, right? It's something that's so deep that I have to respect it because it's something I can't understand. And so, I think that that's the reason why sometimes people confer objectivity upon the kinds of decisions we make when we train an AI, is because most people don't think about computer science day in and day out in their lives. And I think demystifying AI can go a long way towards helping us understand how it can be a useful tool. And that's something that we do whenever we have conversations and conferences like this.
I'm going to invite Dr. Giordano to give a closing comment because we're going to go into our second panel. Dr. Giordano.
Sure, and I'll be short. I mean, I can't help it. I mean, I've always been short, so I'll just be short here as well. For those of you in the audience who are maybe puzzled or at least somewhat kind of scratching your head and going, do I really get it? Why so much of the focus on this particular panel dealt with issues of biosecurity and biosafety relevant to AI in biomedicine and clinical care, I want to show you this. Right? So this is the annual threat assessment of the US intelligence community from the Office of Director of National Intelligence, who explicated that there is an incredible vulnerability of the United States infrastructure and functions of our informational communities to external and internal purloinment based upon the relative volatility and viability of both incorporation and misuse of those data and manipulation of those data and those systems directly, both intramurally as well as extramurally by both state actors and non-state actors. And so as we develop these important systems that we believe to be so very, very important to be able to integrate, synthesize, and use in beneficial ways, various aspects, tiers, and levels of massive data that require machine learning, decision learning, deep learning, and AI, we have to also recognize that the tool, while viable and valuable, is equally vulnerable, and the responsibility for its sound use by ourselves, in other words, the way we use it, is certainly intrinsic. And as each and all of the speakers in the last panel have illustrated, an equal responsibility to be participatory in the global discourse of how these things might be purloined, usurped, misused, is equally and ever more important.
Thank you so much, Dr. Giordano, Dr. DeIlias, Dr. Casewear, Dr. Ofrieder. So I'm going to turn it now over to Rebecca Eberle, who is the director of the Office of Human Research at George Washington University, to introduce panel 2.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to continue the discussion around AI ethics. That was such an interesting panel. This day already, I've learned so much. And with our next panel, we're going to learn more about what the AI technology industry is doing to apply ethics. I'm excited to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Reed Blackman. Dr. Blackman is the author of the book Ethical Machines and founder and CEO of Virtue, an AI ethical risk consultancy. He's also a senior advisor to the Deloitte AI Institute, served as a founding member of Ernst & Young's AI Advisory Board, and volunteers as the Chief Ethics Officer to the nonprofit Government Blockchain Association. Reed's experience is relied upon by Fortune 500 and Global 1000 companies to speak to and educate their people and guide them as they create and scale AI ethical programs. And you can find out more at reedblackman.com. Our second speaker on the panel today is Dr. Tracy Ann Kosa. Dr. Tracy is a privacy advocate, practitioner, and researcher. She's currently a principal product manager at Alexa. Previously, Dr. Kosa served as a staff privacy engineer at Google and finished a postdoc program at Stanford University on predicting privacy regulation. She ran the Global Privacy Compliance Program at Microsoft and served on the City of Seattle's Privacy Advisory Committee. She's originally from Canada, where she focused on Canadian public sector privacy, working in privacy across the government of Ontario in law enforcement, education, health, and social services. She also served as a member for multiple groups and advisory committees, including the TAHSN Research Hospital Network, the University of Toronto's Research Ethics Board, and Privacy Practitioners Community of Practice. She chaired the Program Advisory Committee for the Information Security Diploma Program for York University at Seneca College, taught Canadian Political Science Labs at Ryerson University and Information Systems Labs at UOIT. She holds a doctorate in computer science from UOIT, including research work at the Oxford Internet Institute and the University of Oxford. She holds a master's degree in political science from York University and the University of Manitoba, and honors BA from the University of Windsor. Thank you both so much for being here. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Blackman.
Hi, thanks so much. So what time do I have to go to? To what?
Let me check. I think.
Okay, I'm going to start. Let's start talking. Just text it to me, chat me. Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for coming. So, right, I'm Reed Blackman, and I spend most of my days now advising senior leaders on how to implement AI ethics into their infrastructure, operations, process, practices, so on and so forth. My goal is, my main goal right now is to, one, give a phenomenally a very crashy course on AI, on AI ethics in particular. I'm going to talk through a couple of reasons why AI raises some novel pathways to ethical risks, and why some current ethical risk mitigation strategies are just inappropriate, and the kinds of things that leaders need to do if they're going to actually systematically and comprehensively mitigate ethical risks of AI. Okay, so for those of you not familiar with AI, first of all, when I say AI, I just mean machine learning. And machine learning sounds very intimidating, as is artificial intelligence, but the truth of the matter is that in concept, it's very simple. Programming this stuff is difficult, but in concept, it's just software that learns by example. That's really it, just software that learns by example. So for instance, you've got a bunch of pictures of your dog Pepe, and you want your AI software to learn what Pepe looks like. So you give it a bunch of examples of your dog. Fancy word for example, data. So you give a bunch of data or examples to the AI software, it quote unquote learns the Pepe pattern contained in each picture. And if it does a good job learning, then when you give it a new picture, it says, yes, that's Pepe, or no, it's not Pepe, depending upon whether or not you uploaded a picture of Pepe. So it's just learning by example. That's the core of machine learning. And you'll notice that one thing that you have to do with, if you're going to teach it to learn by example, is that you have to give it, those examples that you teach it with, that's just called training data. And then later, when you upload a new photo, you're giving it some input, and it's going to have an output like, yes, that's Pepe, no, that's not Pepe, so on and so forth. Now, that's all you really need at the core of it to understand about machine learning in order to understand why or how it gives rise to novel sources of ethical risks. So first of all, and this was touched upon in the last panel, the pattern that it recognizes, what it's looking for, might lead to discriminatory or biased outputs. So to take a relatively well-known example, Amazon was famously creating AI software to vet its resumes. So it gets too many resumes. It can't have a person reading all of them. It's just too many. So they took their AI software and they uploaded, or they trained that AI software with resumes that they had received over the previous years, noting which resumes were judged to be worthy of an interview and which were not judged to be worthy of an interview. And so you take all those thousands, tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of examples, and they gave it to their AI. And what was the pattern? What did it find that the interview-worthy resumes have in common? They're mostly by men. And so it started, as it were, red lighting as opposed to green lighting women's resumes. So if the resume said NCAA women's basketball, red light. If it said, if it was the name of a women's college, red light. And you might think, oh, well, then why don't they just tell their software, just ignore the word woman or women, or both. And they tried that, but it turns out that there are other variables in the data that highly correlate with women or with man. And so it just picked up on those variables that highly correlate with men and women. And so they wound up with roughly the same kinds of outputs, continuously, all else equal, green lighting men, red lighting women. Even though the software wasn't looking for men or women when it was looking at which resumes should be red lit and green lit. Okay, so that's a case of discriminatory AI. There's lots of examples of discriminatory AI. So that's one. Another famous one is facial recognition software. So with facial recognition software, you've got to give it lots of examples of the kinds of faces you want to recognize. Historically, and I say historically, I mean in the past several years, the people who have trained facial recognition software haven't used enough examples of, say, Black men and Black women, which resulted in facial recognition software that was really bad at recognizing Black men and Black women, especially Black women. One thing I want to note, and I'll come back to it in a bit, is when people talk about biased AI, there's a strong tendency to just talk about representative data sets, balanced data sets. And either that's shorthand or it's completely misleading. The sources of bias are many, which means that the risk or the bias mitigation strategies are going to be many, right? So in the case of the facial recognition software, it's going to make sense to go find a bunch more pictures, more data of Black men and Black women. For the hiring algorithm, it's not going to make sense to, go get more, instead of going back the past 10 years, go back to the past 20 years of hiring data and then train it with that. More data is better. No, in that case, you're just going to further entrench the bias. So in one case, go get more data. In another case, don't just get more data, at least not at the same kind. And so what the appropriate bias mitigation strategy is going to be will vary. Okay, so that's the problem of bias or discriminatory algorithms. I'll say one last thing. There's lots of ways, other places where bias can come up is it's what training data you use, yes, but also how you weight the variables of that training data. So you might weight some things as more important. So to take the example of determining someone's insurance for driving. You might think something like age should be weighted more than their level of education or something like that. So you're going to weight the variables in certain ways, which will have an impact on what the outputs look like. And that's going to be a source of bias. So tinkering with the tinkering with the weightings of the variables is going to be an appropriate bias mitigation strategy, or your threshold level. So for instance, if you say, give a mortgage to everyone or give insurance to everyone who's sort of above this threshold and deny them coverage if they're below that threshold, well, where you put that threshold is going to make a difference about, it's going to have an impact on how different subpopulations are impacted. So altering the threshold is in some cases, going to be an appropriate bias mitigation strategy. Okay, that's bias. Secondly, when you upload that picture of Pepe, the software is looking at each one of those images at the pixel level. So it's looking at thousands of pixels and the thousands of mathematical relations among those pixels. So the Pepe pattern, the pattern that it's recognizing in all those photos, such that if it sees it in a new photo, says, yes, that's Pepe, is phenomenally complex. It's just too complex for mere mortals to grasp. We can't compute in our heads or keep in our heads thousands of mathematical relations among thousands of variables. this is the problem of explainability. So when you upload that new picture of Pepe and it says, yes, that's Pepe, that's great, it got it right, but the output is unexplainable in the sense that we don't really grasp what the Pepe pattern is. It's just too complex for us. Now, you might not care in the case of dog recognition software. It doesn't matter to you. As long as it's getting it right, that's all that matters. So you might think that, okay, black boxes, not a big deal as long as they're sufficiently reliable. That said, there are going to be lots of cases where you probably do care quite a bit, both for ethical reasons and regulatory reasons. So you might care why that person got denied insurance, or got denied a mortgage, or got denied a job interview, or got denied probation or bail or some such. So in many cases, we're going to care about how the outputs are arrived at. And there's a number of things to talk about here. So when I talk about explainability, there's really, you should keep your eye on at least two kinds of issues when it comes to explainability, or two kinds of explainability rather. There's global explainability, which is roughly, what are the rules of the game here? What are the rules of the model? What are the rules that transform inputs to outputs? Input, application for health insurance, output, yes or no. What are the rules by which someone is approved or denied? That's global explainability. And local explainability is, why did this particular person, or put slightly differently more generally, why did this particular input lead to this particular output? Why did Reed in particular get denied insurance, for instance? And so one reason why explainability is going to be important, there's a variety of reasons, but one reason is that in many cases, we need to know the rules of the game so that we can assess whether the rules are good, just, reasonable, fair. Pick your favorite normative property. Same thing with the local explainability. We want to know whether it's justified that this particular person got denied. So explainability is important for a variety of reasons. We want to be able to debug the software. We want to, in some cases, you need explainability for regulatory compliance. You might need explainability because it's just a matter of respect. People deserve explanations for why they were treated the way that they were, particularly when they were, say, denied a benefit, or especially when they were harmed in some way. And then you might need it because it's a necessary condition for assessing the rules for being justifiable, ethically acceptable. Okay. Notice, again, so with bias, it's the nature of the machine learning beast to notice patterns, even patterns that escape human attention. And that means that it's of the nature of the beast to recognize patterns that may well be discriminatory. Explainability is also a nature of the beast problem. It's the nature of the beast to look for phenomenally complex patterns. So complex that they defy human understanding. So it's the nature of the machine learning beast that we've got this explainability problem. Okay, third thing. As I've said, machine learning learns by examples, just learning by example software. And the examples are data, and in many cases, it's data about people. So me, you, everybody else. This is just to say that the fuel of machine learning is often people's data. So if you're a data scientist or an engineer or just an organization who wants to leverage AI, that means that you're highly incentivized to get as much data about as much people as you can, because all else equal, the more data you have about them, the better your machine learning is going to be, the better your AI is going to be. So it's of the nature of the machine learning beast that it requires a tremendous amount of data to work well, which incentivizes sucking up as much data about people as you can, which is to say it incentivizes violations of privacy. That's one way in which machine learning threatens to violate people's privacy. Another way is that, look, so then there are just particular applications for AI. So think about facial recognition software again. You might surveil a population that ought not to be surveilled, and you violate their privacy because of that particular use case for machine learning. But then there's also just the simple case of machine learning is broadly in the business of making certain kinds of predictions or inferences. Okay, this person sort of, as it were, looks like this. This is the data about them. So they are likely to default on a mortgage. They are likely to be successful at this job. They're likely to, commit a crime again in the next 2 years or something along those lines. It could be the case that machine learning, it is the case that machine learning can make certain kinds of predictions about people that turn out to be both true and constitute a violation of privacy. So, for example, suppose an organization has a bunch of data about people's geolocations, where they go, when they go there, so on and so forth. That's one data set that they've got. Let's assume that it's okay for them to have that. They might have another data set that is just the addresses of therapists. And you might think, oh, that's fine if they have that. Then they take those two data sets, they combine them, they run them through the machine learning algorithm, and yada, yada, yada. The machine is pretty good at predicting, or at if you like, inferring who is seeing a therapist. Because after all, it knows where the therapists are practicing, it knows where these people's homes are, it knows when they're going, to this address where there's a therapist, and it's every Tuesday at 3:30, so on and so forth. So you might think then that, okay, now there's a new piece of knowledge that's been arrived at, which is that this person sees the therapist weekly. And you might think that having that kind of data, having that kind of knowledge itself constitutes a violation of privacy. So again, machine learning is the kind of thing that requires a lot of data to work well, which incentivizes violations of privacy. There are use case applications of AI, like facial recognition software, that themselves are crucial in violating people's privacy. And then there are the kinds of predictions you might make about people, which themselves constitute violations of privacy. Okay, so those are the big three in my estimation. Discriminatory models, unexplainable models, and privacy violations. There are also plenty of use case specific ethical risks. I mentioned one with facial recognition software. To take another one that everyone is already familiar with, think about self-driving cars. We have self-driving cars because we have AI software. And there, the ethical risk is killing and maiming pedestrians. So it's not about bias or black boxes or privacy violations. The bigger risk is death. Okay, and there's loads of kinds of ethical risks that you could realize depending upon the use case. What does all this mean? Okay, it means that we need some kind of comprehensive approach. Organizations need a comprehensive approach to systematically identifying and mitigating those risks. Now, where are companies now? The vast majority are nowhere close. So I'll tell you a little bit about where they are now and what the problems are and how it leaves a lot of ethical risk on the table, not to mention reputational risk, legal risk, and so on. So let's go back to bias models for a second, discriminatory AI. What you get, let's say you're distributing a good like health insurance across various populations. So you input all the training data, blah, 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 and then you say yes and no to various people, whether or not they get health insurance. And then you ask yourself, I wonder if the distribution of insurance is fair or just or equitable, pick your favorite normative property. And then if you're a data scientist, here's what you're going to do. You're going to take, and this is what most organizations, if organizations are doing anything, this is what they're doing. You take these mathematical or quantitative metrics for fairness as found in the machine learning fairness literature, and then you apply it to those outputs and you say, oh, how do I score according to these quantitative metrics for fairness as found in the academic literature? And here's the thing, you'll score poorly on well, poorly on some, you'll score well on some, poorly on others. Now here's the crucial thing. Those metrics are incompatible with each other. You simply cannot score well on all of them at the same time. Some of them require you to minimize false negatives. Others require you to minimize false positives. Otherwise, others require you to maximize true positives, and so on. And you can't do all these things at the same time. It's just not feasible. So a very substantive, qualitative, ethical decision needs to be made. What's the appropriate metric for fairness for this particular use case? And this is a question that data scientists are simply ill-equipped to answer. It's an ethical question. It's also a legal question in some cases. It's also a business question, frankly, but it's not the kind of question that a data scientist is standardly trained for. Okay, so what does this say? One thing this says is that what we need are subject matter experts involved in the right kind of way to spot, first of all, spot likelihood of biased models, but also here's just one example in which the quantitative approach requires a qualitative approach as well, and that qualitative approach is not well executed by data scientists. You need something like, for instance, ethicists, let's just say, subject matter experts. Okay, so if companies are doing anything around biased models, and I'm talking about the vast majority, not every company, but if they're doing something, then they're telling the data scientists, use these tools to ferret out bias, but this is not real. It's not real bias mitigation, because you can just choose the metric that you're already scoring well on and say, yep, we scored well on that metric for fairness, and so we're all good, even though someone who actually knows what they're looking at would say, oh no, that's a terrible metric to score well on. That's actually completely unjust if you're scoring well on that metric. You should be scoring well on this other incompatible metric. Okay, so that's common approach and still leaving a lot of risk on the table with bias. Go back to explainability. What do we have? Well, we've got a number of technical tools once again. So technologists say, oh, the black boxes, they're not really so black. We've got these tools called Lyman Chap, and they give us a sense of what variables are playing what kind of role in the outputs. Now, a couple things to say here. Number one, still, these are best guesses. These are approximations of what's going on inside the box. It can't be completely 100% accurate because, of course, it's the nature of these tools to simplify the complex. And at some point, you're simplifying the complex to the point of distortion. At what point is it distortion, as opposed to it's still sufficiently accurate representation? It's not going to be a question that data scientists are well suited to answer. Furthermore, these technical tools are interpretable or understandable or intelligible to data scientists, not to regulators, not to, say, the average patient or the average doctor or the average nurse or the average regulator or the average member of Congress. So these very technical explanations are at best good for the data scientists, not good for the loads of other people that need explanations. Then the last thing to say is to reiterate the point I made earlier, which is that explainability is an enabler for assessments of justification, where justification has to do with what are the rules of the system, fair, just, reasonable, good, etc. And Lyman, Chap, and other technical tools cannot help with that. So it's another place where the technical approach to explainability is clearly insufficient to the task of sufficiently identifying, understanding, and mitigating the ethical risks related to black boxes. Okay, so still lots on the table. What do we need here? Once again, we're going to need certain kinds of expertise, certain kinds of experts, like if we're assessing the rules of the game and whether they're just or fair, you might want lawyers involved, and or ethicists or civil rights experts, and so on and so forth. And the stakeholders that are impacted as well. We could talk about, someone in the previous panel said you have to consult all the stakeholders. I'm not sure that's right. I'd be happy to talk about it in the Q&A. Okay, and now you come to privacy violations. And now what are companies doing around privacy violations? The answer is mostly misunderstanding what it's about, at least from an ethical perspective. So when people hear the word privacy, the vast majority of organizations hear privacy, they hear, I would say, one of three things. They hear either cybersecurity practices, which is very important, but it's often not what people are talking about when they're talking about the ethical implications of AI and as it relates to privacy. So there's cybersecurity, there's regulatory compliance with things like GDPR and CCPA. GDPR is EU regulations, the General Data Protection Regulation, and the CCPA is the California Consumer Protection Act. I think that's right. So they're talking about regulatory compliance, which is good, but as you can imagine, the set of ethical risks is not identical to the set of regulatory risks, which means that you might be fully compliant with all the regulations and nonetheless not see all the ethical risks that exist. And then the third thing people will talk about is anonymizing the data. Privacy, the idea being privacy is sufficiently respected on the condition that the data is sufficiently anonymized and cannot be de-anonymized. Or at least the probability of its being de-anonymized is sufficiently low for the use case, given the risks, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. One of the major problems here, though, is that when people are talking about privacy, and this is well known in healthcare, they're often talking about something like a right to be exercised. It's not a passive state in which your data is not accessed, as in the case of cybersecurity, nor is it not simply the passive state of not being known. Privacy is the right to have control over something or other. So to take a sort of more mundane case, your right to privacy means that you've got a right to pull down the shades in your bedroom. and a right to pull them up when you want to, and a right to let people into the room if you want. So it's a capacity. So in the context of AI and data in particular, the right to privacy has a lot to do with who has control over what data. So if you're really maximally respecting people's privacy, then you're going to give them, to the extent that you can, maximal control over the data that they have, the data that there is about them. Who has access to it, under what conditions, for how long, so on and so forth, who they can share it with. Okay, and that issue of who ought to have control of the data is, from an ethical perspective, and whether or not consumers, citizens, patients, et cetera, should have the ultimate control of that data, is simply something that most organizations don't deal with, unless there's something they need to be something they need to do in order to be compliant with regulations. Okay. So we've got three big ethical risks: biased AI, unexplainable AI, privacy violations. We have use case specific risks. And we see time and time again that technologists want to apply technical tools to try to solve the privacy problems. In the case of cybersecurity, of course, there are technical tools for cybersecurity. And in the case of anonymization, that's a technical tool. But in each one of those big three risks, we see that the technical solutions are not really solutions. They're part of the puzzle. Please don't take me to say these things are useless. They're very useful, but they simply are not sufficient. They're clearly not sufficient. And in each one of those cases, what you need are certain kinds of subject matter experts to be involved in the conversation and decision about what should we do and how should we do it. So for instance, and I've said this, I said this before, you might need an ethicist there. You might need a lawyer there. A lot of these decisions are the risks, the ethical and reputational risks, at least for many organizations, they're going to balance them against straightforward business risks. And so many organizations should have someone from the business side of the house present. You need a technologist present because they know what to do. They know what can and cannot be done. It's easy for, say, an ethicist like myself to say, oh, just, go use one of those fairness tools and here's the appropriate metric for fairness. But if they then say, actually, we don't have the demographic data, we're legally barred from collecting that data. And then I say, well, just then use synthetic data. And then only the technologist is going to be able to tell me whether or not synthetic data is creatable or gettable for this particular use case. I'm not going to know that as an ethicist. Technologists will know what's technologically feasible. So to my mind, all of this points to the absolute need for something like an ethics committee, an IRB, I don't care what you call it, a risk board, to be involved in the entire life cycle of an AI product. As was mentioned in the earlier panel, having those people involved at conception, at the point at which people are trying to solve the problem, they're thinking about how AI can be used to solve the problem. They should be involved there, involved with considerations around what's the training data look like, how do we weight the variables, what's the threshold, what's the objective function, what are we trying to maximize here? What kinds of explanations do we need? Who needs what kinds of explanations? Why do they need them? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't see how we can do AI responsibly in line with acceptable ethical standards if organizations don't have something akin to an ethics committee or an IRB involved in the product lifecycle of AI. Okay, I'm just going to stop there. I have 4 more minutes, but I think that's the core of it. And besides, you listened to me prattle on long enough. So I'll end there, and I'm looking forward to what Tracy has to say, because I think, given what we talked about earlier, we might disagree about some things. I kind of hope that we do. It makes it more interesting. So thanks very much, everyone. Looking forward to your questions, and go for it, Tracy.
Thanks, Reed.
Thank you so much, Reed. And now I'll turn it over to you, Tracy.
Beautiful. First of all, thanks everybody for sticking in. This has been a long day and lots of really interesting topics. All right, so let's jump in. I've divided my talk into basically 3 parts. I want to share a little bit about my experience on Axon's ethics committee with you all, some ideas about different approaches for managing ethics, and then of course the obligatory pop culture reference, which today is going to be about the Matrix, and talk to you a little bit about why I think none of this matters, because the decisions have all been made already. So let's talk about Axon. For those of you who are unaware, Axon is the company that developed tasers, and they have a fairly, I'll use the word loosely, ethical origin story. The CEO had, unfortunately, several friends die of gun violence when he was young, and decided that instead of continuing this ongoing battle in the United States about gun rights, maybe the answer was to provide an alternative that was less injurious. So he went on the path of creating this taser. The tasers are now deployed pretty worldwide, actually. Canada's got them, the UK's got them, they're all over the United States. And Axon's mission has slowly started to increase from the idea of protecting life to this idea of preserving truth and accelerating justice. And they're moving much more into the controversial space around body cameras, metadata of the use of force in the policing system, and also into military and law enforcement, military technologies. So while they were thinking through these problems, it became pretty obvious a number of years ago that they would need what Dr. Blackman calls the other people at the table, the ethicists, the philosophers, all of those folks. Some of those stakeholders, I think, were already represented, but quite a few were not. And the CEO and the leadership team essentially decided that creating this external ethics board, IRB, REB, whatever you want to call it, would be a good stepping stone to addressing some of the concerns that their employees had brought up in the product development lifecycle. We had a lot of really interesting meetings. I'm no longer on the board, but they encouraged us, even as members, to continue to talk openly about the work that went on, which is what I'm going to share with you today. I think one of our first challenges was basically all of the questions that you've all brought up in various panels today, which is, first of all, how do you define ethics? Second of all, whose is it? And third of all, how do you think about it at scale? But as a group, what we landed on as our first hotly debated topic in this very first meeting oh so long ago was, who the hell is the customer? Because you can look at a company like Axon that's providing policing technology and say, well, it's obvious, right? The customers are the police officers and the law enforcement agencies that spend the money at Axon to buy their technology. But it became quickly apparent that that's really an oversimplification. Why do we have policing services? Citizens pay for them. So maybe Axon's customer base is actually the general population who is, for want of a better word, consenting to being policed. And one of the reasons this became important is because we were trying to set up evaluation criteria to think about the products and services that Axon was developing. And right away, one of the big problems with these products and services was the idea that you can look at evaluation criteria for all of these things and basically spend all day rat holing on them. But your engineers are standing over here, your product development people are standing over here, your shareholders are standing over here saying, you get to market fast. So how do we scale it? So we've talked already a lot about privacy issues. Security is another ethical component. Of course, user trust, algorithmic bias comes into play here, surveillance, data control, transparency, and misuse. And these were intended to be established as bucketing criteria for a conversation that you would have with the appropriate stakeholders in the room. Like we've seen over and over again in the privacy space in the last 20 years, as the privacy review process got embedded in gating processes for releasing software at scale, it just slowed everything down. And the perception very much became in the privacy profession that we were a tax and not a benefit. And so Axon was very conscious of that. And this was established as a trigger point for having conversations about what the potential evaluative ethical implications would be for a product. The first one we dove on was facial recognition. And of course, there's a number of use cases that you can come up with here. Terrorism is everyone's favorite. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse is a great way to justify any kind of human invasion you would like to. Of course, then we move on to homicide. There's a most wanted list, an opt-in program for people who have family members who are mentally or physically ill and prone to wander. But the one that resonated the most strongly with the folks at the table for our first go around was this notion of kidnapping. What about kidnapping cases, specifically about facial recognition matching for your victim, perhaps even in real time? as we walked through these use cases, the team, the product management team, the engineers, the program managers, everybody who's tactically involved in making decisions around the development of this product, decided to highlight the motivation, the scenario, and the examples. I'm not going to read this through to you, but essentially the case study that we landed on, again, wanted to go easy right out of the gate, is you've got a child who's been kidnapped. You consent to the police to include that child's photograph in a facial recognition database. The officer who is in the field pulls over a car for whatever reason, suspicious behavior, whatever is lawfully acceptable in their jurisdiction. They have their body camera on, they lean into the car, and they can automatically scan the face of everyone in the car. They're lawfully able to collect that without consent under most jurisdictions. And the matching that would come in would then take place at the back end in the technology, triggered by someone reviewing those facial recognition photos and matches from the algorithms that are being used to identify them, and then communicate that to the officer in their earbud, who could then subsequently take action in the field. Sounds like a really good news story. So we sat down with the team and we looked at our ethics criteria, and we said, all right, let's come up with pros and cons for each of these ethical categories, and then make some notes around things we want to consider. So of course, privacy is top of mind, an opt-in model for your kidnapping victim, an opt-in model for their family. We need to discuss whether removal actually constitutes deletion, because if you think you're deleting digital data, you never are. And then, of course, there were some special considerations around user trust. You know, what if you're the family member who agrees to opt into the system and you think you're getting your child back, but lo and behold, it's actually an error in the facial recognition system. How do we compensate for that? The more interesting questions, I think, come in under the surveillance category, because a system like this is essentially training the population to be comfortable with surveillance. And there's a social impact to that, particularly outside of the United States, where there's still a notion of privacy in public. So how do we think about that? How does Axon think about the creation of their products being a slippery slope to mass social surveillance? Well, I mean, you can take a guess here, but the answer is they don't, because that's not part of the incentivization for the development of their products. They did, however, want to think about what the criteria were to trigger an ethical review. This was kind of interesting because, again, as everyone's pointed out today, it introduces a lot of bias into the system simply by establishing criteria to say when we're going to be ethical, this is the point in time, versus no, we're not going to be deliberately ethical over here. We came up with 4 different criteria. Of course, if it's brand new technology, one of the things we were debating at the time was real-time facial recognition on drones that could be flown around neighborhoods or particularly high crime neighborhoods to determine, for preservation of the safety of the officers who needed to walk in that neighborhood as a substitute for them. I think the other one that's pretty easy to trigger is if we're not really sure what the thing can do. And that frankly happens more often than not in every large tech company I've worked at. We're building stuff because we can build it. We're not really sure what it does or what it's going to do when it's released. And then, of course, how widespread the technology will be. If you're releasing something to a specific group of people who are well known and there's a relationship established and there's limitations built in, that's great. If not, then you need to really take a pause and have a more substantive conversation. And then finally, of course, my Canadian content of the reasonable person test. This is a well-established legal test in Canada that was used at the Supreme Court to determine expectations around the use of technology and the collection, use, and disclosure of data. Essentially, picture yourself explaining the thing to a reasonable person, AKA not an ethicist, not a philosopher, not a computer scientist, just random Joe on the street, your grandmother, your kid, whoever, somebody who's not in this space. What would their expectations be? So all in all, I think Axon really made a reasonable effort here to come up with a process, to come up with some standards, to address the scale problem. And they continue, as far as I know, to use this on a regular basis. There's a lot of publicly available information about what else the board does. And I think it's worthwhile for those of you who are interested to take a look. There's a lot of good reports. There's a lot of balanced conversation around the technology, but everything's still getting built and released. So what are the other options? Well, A couple of folks today started the conversation about harms or touched on it lightly, but I think it's really the Future of Privacy Forum that's done a fantastic job outlining that privacy harms are much more substantive than something embarrassing. People die from privacy invasions, people lose their jobs, people lose their livelihood, and they get incarcerated. And these are all really important things to consider as we consider what technologies we're building and why. The other aspect that you could look at from a harms perspective to contemplate how AI and ML technologies will impact the rest of us is this concept of knowability. The fancy explanation on the left of the screen is really about the expression of that mathematically and for risk management purposes. But I personally have a soft spot, not for Donald Rumsfeld himself, but for this particular explanation. A long time ago in respect of foreign policy, Rumsfeld articulated a really interesting paradigm of knowability. There are known knowns, things we know when we play with this algorithm or this ML or this data set that we're going to introduce. Bias, for example. No one outside of a judge's chamber or a baby carriage believes in unbiased anything. So we know that's going to happen. We've got some known unknowns. There's stuff that we've seen before go really badly that we can expect will go badly again. Google Photos facial recognition in its early days identified Black women as gorillas. Tay, Microsoft's automated Twitter bot, took less than 12 hours to start spewing anti-Semitism. We know things are going to go wrong. Then you've got this wonderful category of the unknown unknowns. And that's where all those unintended consequences come in. And I think folks have touched on them briefly. But the truth is, there are so many of these that it's almost impossible to catalog them. We've seen instances where technology is being used, facial recognition software, to try to identify people who are homosexual. This was adopted by governments where homosexuality is illegal, and despite the fact it was subsequently proven to be inaccurate on pretty much every level, had passed an IRB review at Stanford, and the paper was subsequently published. There's the driverless cars, which, as Dr. Blackman already talked about, actually do kill people when they make mistakes. There's things like automated license plate recognition software, which neighborhoods are using to identify vehicles that are undesirable and proactively report them to the police for being physically in the neighborhood. There's, of course, instance after instance after instance of facial recognition technologies being used inaccurately, inappropriately to detain and incarcerate the Black Americans at a much higher rate than anyone else in the population. There's automated grading systems that are now being used so that teachers no longer have to go through the pain of reading their students' papers. There's automated grading in the UK that was used recently to determine whether or not you were allowed to go to university, which caused a hell of an outcry. There's another classroom technology that's just been released recently by Intel in partnership with some other teams that will be used layered on top of video conferencing calls to inform you as to the emotional state of everyone who is on that visual call with you. So those unknowns keep multiplying. So maybe there's another way. In computer science, we often look at fault tree or failure models. So essentially, these are either top-down deductive failure analysis, which looks at exactly what went wrong and how that traces down to the system component parts. A failure model is more of a FEMA model. It's a systematic approach to saying, this is the workflow of your system, what went wrong and where and why. These work to varying degrees, but as you can tell, are mostly reactive. When you talk about embedded ethics, what I see a lot of smaller companies doing is layering transparency and context for ethical concerns in the HR departments. In engineering and product management, there are triggers for ethical evaluations or harms, identifications used on the basic software development product release cycle. And then, of course, sales is intended to work to determine what exactly customers are going to do with a given set of technology. I know the real key here has been to think about IRBs or an ethical review process as a potential for addressing all these concerns, and definitely it's a mechanism. However, it doesn't scale. It's still incredibly subjective. And I would argue, even with something like the human subject rights that were published in 2010 under the National Institutes of Justice, they're still incredibly biased. We're still thinking about this problem the way we've thought about climate change and frankly, the way we've thought about COVID. At no point in time does the algorithm go, oh, whoops, I'm at the US border. I'm going to stop now because that's my harsh point. It's just not how computers work. It's just not how data flows. And it's just not how systems are architected. So here we get to the cliche part, the sound of inevitability. If we were in person, I would do my Neo dodging bullets example for you, but it doesn't play as well on the camera. So why doesn't it matter? Because the truth is, it is inevitable. The decisions, the really important ones, have already been made. And there's very little we can change at this point. AI systems, we know, perpetuate stereotypes. We also know they give you really bad mental health issues. And that when you layer them on top of systematic inequality, systems that are broken, and I would challenge anyone to tell me that we're not pretty broken right now, they only seek to magnify the system inequalities. We've got hundreds of frameworks globally for everybody who wants to develop an ethical AI. It's great. I mean, it's really important to think about. It's a great thought exercise. None of those frameworks have any kind of adoption, enforceability, or acceptance. If you think that it's difficult to get the 40-odd people on this call to have a conversation about ethics, try doing it in an engineering company with 72,000 engineers. They're not going to make the same coding decisions. They're not going to make the same data decisions. They're going to do it from their own perspective. Which brings us to Weinkopf's research. Who has the most impact in this space? Well, you'd think users, you'd think the algorithm itself, you'd think clients, developers, or investors. But the truth is it completely differs depending on which company, which context, and what their motivations are. There's also a small problem of institutional perspective versus the resource dependency. In other words, who's accountable? Like, so Google Photos misidentifies people and perpetuates racial stereotypes. Is it the engineer who coded that stuff? Is it the department? Is it the person who runs the company? These companies are all so large and power has moved so far to the outskirts of these decisions that there isn't an accountability framework anymore. When Weinkopf did a series of interviews with AI entrepreneurs, each and every one of them, grammatical errors aside, said the most important thing in AI technology is to be the most fast, AKA get your stuff to market and get it there before everybody else does and get it adopted. Ethics come in way at the bottom of the list. The first concern after getting there fast is what are your technical limitations? Well, that leads to things like Clearview, where you just take a publicly available database, build a facial recognition app, throw it in the app store, and before you know it, every cop on the beat has downloaded it onto their personal iPhone and they're using it in the field, whether you want them to or not. There's financial incentives, of course. And then you have the small problem of regulation, which, as Dr. Blackman mentioned, GDPR, CCPA, a bunch of other ones come into effect. But these entrepreneurs don't care about that until they have enough scale to warrant concerns around compliance. Regulatory capture is a real thing. Then when we talk about the normative values, right down at the very bottom, what does it mean to be human? How does that play in? Bottom of the list. Jacob Ward gave a really interesting talk at Stanford earlier in April. And I believe he's also publishing a book about this, but he identified something really interesting called the loop. And this loop is really where we see the harms that algorithms can produce on our society. As everybody mentioned, massive data sets. They all get trained into these algorithms, and then eventually the algorithms train themselves, and ML models are developed by other ML models. They analyze all of our preferences, and guess what? We're not all that unique, and in fact, at scale, we're quite predictable. Then it presents these options to your average data subject or person interacting with this machine, and you select from your options. The algorithm learns from what Tracy has selected, reads those preferences, and generates an even shorter list of options for the next choice, for the next choice, for the next choice. This, incidentally, is essentially the 101 of how to build a filter bubble, which we've seen the harmful effects of in the United States most painfully over the last few years. This is how these platforms make money. YouTube is incentivized to keep you on the platform. What keeps you on the platform is showing you stuff you agree with. So it just happens over and over and over again. And it's not just recommendation systems. It's also the decision-making systems. This is 9 different examples of programs that are currently in play, being used by massive government agencies and private sector corporations to make decisions about all of us with significant investment. One of the ones I mentioned earlier was the classroom, reading the classroom. There are some folks, of course, who are super excited about this. It's a real advance in facial recognition technology. I lean more towards the morally reprehensible side of the house, where I really don't believe that students should have to police how they look in the classroom. And what cognitive and emotional states they may have shouldn't have to be subject to a machine learning algorithm. Another good example of this is going to be when Effecta and Viston release their interior sensing algorithm, which will essentially do what Tesla did for all the cars around the Tesla inside. And it will make it mandatory, I believe, and the European Commission has already made this decision, to have this technology inside of cars, trucks, vans, and buses to make sure that we know that while you're driving, you're paying attention. But it's not going to stop there. It'll also start to talk about cognition. And then we have, I think, the icing on the cake. MIT has just kicked off this new series about how AI is essentially a colonist approach. It doesn't capture land, of course, but it has the same desire for profit. And we will see the more users that a company can acquire, the more it can harvest from their activities, their events, their movements, even their physical gait. The more data it has for its algorithm, and the more it can acquire for its products. So if you really broaden this view of AI on technology, I think talking about the context of an ethical framework or an ethical review process at this point, the ship has sailed. What we really need to be talking about is what we actually can and should be fixing. First of all, and I'll refer to Dr. Giordano on this for the OG DARPA, but we built an internet that was deliberately intended to authenticate, authorize, and non-repudiate the users of that system. Building privacy into something that was inherently meant to be identifiable is non sequitur. It's just a ridiculous thing to attempt to do. We need to go right back down to the pipes and start over again. We have this existing legal approach that we use to privacy and data structures. In the United States, it's about data points. You know, Robert Bork lost his Supreme Court seat because of his video rental records. So we have the Video Rental Privacy Protection Act. This piecemeal approach to data points ignores the fact that we have all essentially become commodified and digitized. So it isn't about just my medical records anymore. It's about everything to do with me, including the inferred, observed, and derived data that these machines are using to inform who I am and what my profiles are. We look to scientific research as a policy input, but it's a pretty well-established cycle. Some technology gets created, everybody gets scared, policymakers look for researchers to do research about it, researchers do the research and come up with new conclusions so that they can get that attention that they need to that research. That's the input to policy. And then the issue goes away because it becomes politicized. Like when politicians told everybody that cell phones were to blame for the decreasing mental health of our youngsters. And then we repeat the cycle. Until that breaks, we're not going to get anywhere. Regulatory capture, we could talk about that for the rest of the day. All you have to do if you don't want any of this stuff enforced is handicap the people who are enforcing it. Right now, global privacy regulations and the enforcement of them are done piecemeal. Let's not even begin to think we can come up with one that works for algorithmic bias. There's an accountability problem, as I mentioned earlier. Is it the software engineer who's responsible for writing the wrong code? When Therac 25 rolled out, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, it was a lot of people who were held accountable for that misstep in radiation that killed lots and lots of people. And then, of course, we have this fundamental human problem of anthropomorphization. My Roomba has a name. My phone has a name. I am imbuing all of these things around me with human characteristics that it doesn't have and doesn't care about. But I'm layering the way that I trust. I trust by repeated interaction. That's a human trust. These machines don't. That's not how they work. There's no human value involved in any of them. There's no relationship there. And that's where we really get into I think, the fundamental problem here, which is we're talking about trying to build human values into something that inherently doesn't have it and is inherently biased towards efficiency and effectiveness, which is pretty antithetical to the human experience. To quote Jacob Ward, we like using algorithms because it's faster than human choice, and it absolves us both of the tedium and the moral horror of our choices. So yes, I definitely disagree with Dr. Blackman.
Great, thank you so much for that presentation. That was really interesting and generated a lot of interesting thoughts. I mean, it's definitely an evolving industry, and so that was great. So now I wanted to open it up to you and Dr. Blackman to discuss just your presentations and what you agree and disagree on. I thought that to start us off, if you wanted to discuss perhaps one thing that you think should be implemented or changed in terms of applying ethics to AI, and how that would lead to more successful implementation of AI technologies.
Well, so sorry, wait. So I do want to try to sort of figure out what you disagree with me about. I kind of want to know, okay. So you gave us a very good laundry list of things that are totally ethically screwed up on board. But then there was a conclusion that was something like, and so ethics can't solve that problem. Seems odd to me, seems like an odd inference to make. The environment is completely messed up. Let's not worry about the ethical implications of of climate change. That wouldn't follow. That would be an odd thing. I think mostly what we say is things like, we're destroying the planet for future generations. That's ethically unacceptable. People are suffering right now from climate change. That's ethically unacceptable. So we better change our approaches. In response to the medical profession has a phenomenal history of doing ethically abhorrent things. That's why we have the Belmont report, why we have IRBs, not perfect solutions. They're not perfect solutions, but to say that they've done nothing seems to be just empirically false. No one thinks that ethics committees can solve all the problems. First of all, no one should think that the problem can just be solved, right? It's our ethical risk mitigation. It's not about elimination. Elimination is not on the table. That's just not gonna happen. So we're talking about mitigation, and the upshot of the claim that I made is that ethics committees are a crucial part of the mitigation efforts within a private company. I certainly think we also need regulations and a number of other things. So the first thing to say something like, how does the laundry list of ethically bad things show us that that we don't need ethics or something along those lines? And then I guess what else do we disagree? What do we disagree about? I'm just struggling to figure out what that is.
So I think the nutshell is, I would tell you those decisions have all already been made. And the idea that we can have any influence beyond having a wonderful academic conversation about it is just false. Like, we can conduct all these reviews, but we're layering a process that, sure, ostensibly could potentially stop a few bad decisions or unintended consequences, but we're layering it onto technologies and systems that are already built, already designed, already well established, already have a lot of bias in them, and we're just augmenting those problems. So it's not that I perhaps disagree with where you're coming from, it's that I think it's futile.
Again, that just seems to be utterly unwarranted. I mean, look at race. Let's go back to, I don't care, 1800. Look at the racism in America. What it is built into the structure. It's an ethical shit show. It's embedded in our laws, in people's attitudes. It's blah 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 blah. You fast forward, things are a lot better. I'm not, there's still lots of problems, but the idea that there hasn't been any progress made since 1800 on race relations in America is empirically preposterous. And so why would we think there's any different? The decisions have not already been made. Lots of decisions have been made, but we're still at the beginning stages of AI, and we have lots more stuff to do. Lots more use cases, lots more data scientists and engineers, many more CEOs and chief information officers and chief analytics officers, blah, blah, blah. There's lots of decisions left to be made. I don't see where the fatalism comes from. I just don't get it.
Well, I appreciate your optimism, but speaking as a woman in America, I would argue that those rights are being rolled back by the day. So I don't think there's a lot of progress being made.
Okay, I'm a Jew in America. Who cares? I wasn't allowed to swim in pools. My people weren't allowed to swim in pools. There was the Holocaust. Oh, who cares? Right? I mean, not who cares, but I mean, that doesn't show us that progress hasn't been made. And do you think there's been no moral progress in say the US or the world in the past, ever? Is there no such thing as moral progress?
I think in the context of AI, what I'm saying is that we have already created a number of structures that have inherent flaws in them for large groups of people around the world. And the idea that somehow putting an algorithm or a machine learning tool or a decision support system into those structures without considering the context is ridiculous. You can address the actual AI itself, you can address bias in your data set, but if you're handing it over to a systemically racist law enforcement agency to use, then it's not going to end well.
Well, okay, so there are two things to say. Number one, one is you can only do so much, right? So if you're like, I work with a bunch of, Fortune 500, Global 1000 companies who create products that are used all across the world, blah, blah, blah. And sometimes they'll say, hey, how do we stop them from doing X, Y, or Z with our product? And I say, well, first of all, you can alter some of the product features that you've got. You can articulate best practices to them as best you can, ethical best practices, explain to them what the ethical risks are, make them part of the onboarding and training, blah, blah, blah. At the end of the day, though, you can do your due diligence, you can do what you're responsible for, but you can't force their hand. Okay, it's mitigation, it's not elimination. But the idea that, I don't really understand. I mean, the idea that you can't control the entirety of the impacts of the thing that you build, and so it's all futile. I don't think denying that claim is optimism. I think it's clearly true that we can do ethical risk mitigation on a small scale, and it's hard to do it on a large scale, but you can certainly do it on a small scale. And when I say a small scale, I mean a Fortune 500 company can create an ethical risk program and create policies and procedures. And I mean, I've seen it. So I'm confused.
Yeah, I'm sure they can create policies and procedures. I mean, I work at most of those companies and I've seen them create the policies and procedures. But if you think that those policies and procedures, if they come into conflict with the bottom line or what the shareholders need to hear this quarter, is going to win out, then you're sorely mistaken. I mean, I get your argument.
That's obviously not my claim, though.
People, etc. But it's still
that's a straw man. You're fighting a straw man. It's not the case that I've ever said ethics will always win the day. Hurrah! Of course, that's absurd. And of course, there's going to be cases in which ethically awful things are done in pursuit of the bottom line. There's not a question about that. Do I think that there are still loads of other kinds of things to be done? Yes. Do I think we need regulations in addition to ethics committees such that it's not even an ethics committee thing? It's just it's regulatory compliance requires such, on the condition that the regulations are sufficiently enforced, blah, blah, blah. There's lots of pieces to the puzzle. We could just swap out AI and just, put in any other ethical problem we've ever faced and still face, and we can see mitigation, successful mitigation efforts. Is that not true? Is progress, is the view that progress is impossible?
No, my view, Reed, is that technology isn't universally great. And there is a tipping point along the entire human spectrum from when we used rocks as tools to now using Facebook as a political tool. There are decisions that get made along the way where you cannot turn around anymore, where the architecture has been set, where the infrastructure has been decided. And you can have all sorts of great conversations about unintended consequences and purpose binding limitations to your technology and your data set. But at the end of the day, it is still technically feasible within our system, within our architecture, to get around all of them. It's not that we shouldn't have the conversation. What I'm saying is, let's at least recognize that having the conversation is the goal in and of itself.
No, that's silly. I mean, look,
Oh,
hey, let's go back to 1800. Okay, listen, they're starting to talk about all these laws around making Black people equal, but you know what? I bet we can find ways around it. Yeah, they're right. Okay, so there's going to be bad actors who break the rules, who find their way around things, who maneuver, who work the system. But to think that in 1800, look, we can have the conversation about having Black people equal, but let's recognize that the conversation about Black people being equal is just a conversation. That's the end in itself. We're not actually going to make progress because people can always work around the system. That would be a very odd thing to say. We would say, no, the conversation is for the point of passing new laws, new regulations, new modes of operation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Why? I just can't see why it's any different with AI.
Is there, so, and I think that these are, definitely interesting arguments. Is there an area where you can both agree on part of it? And then I'd like to bring in some questions because we are getting several questions coming in because I think your conversation's generating a lot of thought in the audience. But is there an area where you could see eye to eye in applying ethics to AI?
Well, I think one of the things that I appreciate about all the panelists who spoke today is the need for the diversity of perspective in the conversation. We don't have that right now. And if you're sitting in a room in any of these companies, and even just personally, and you look around and everybody looks like you or has your same background, that's a pretty good place to start raising a flag to say that we're missing some perspective here.
So I don't disagree with that, but I actually do think that the talk for diversity of perspectives is it sounds really good and it's true. There should be more diverse AI teams, more diversity among senior leadership, yada yada yada, for reasons having all sorts of reasons, especially those having to do with proper response to historical injustices, what people deserve here and now, so on and so forth. But for instance, when it comes to bias mitigation in AI, I don't think having diverse perspectives or something like that is going to be the most effective bias mitigation strategy. There's hard things to be done, like what's the appropriate threshold, what's the appropriate weighting for the variables, what's the appropriate objective function, blah, 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 blah. What's the appropriate quantitative metric of fairness? And they're just, there's going to be a level of expertise that's going to be, I think, more important than having a bunch of stakeholders, various stakeholders involved. The other thing is that, we talk about, one of the previous panels said something like, we need everyone who's going to be impacted at the table. It's literally impossible, right? And how finely grained are we going to slice up the groups? They're so fine grained. So I'm all for having stakeholder engagement, stakeholder involvement, having them at the table as best we can, and so on and so forth. But number one, I don't think there's good empirical evidence to think that's the most effective bias mitigation strategy for an AI product, a particular AI model. The other thing is that having diverse AI teams is a multi-generational goal, one that we should absolutely pursue. But it's not here now. So if that's a necessary condition for debiasing AI, then we're not going to have debiased AI for generations.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. It made me think about just, as a director of the Office of Human Research and working closely with the IRB, we do our best to make sure our boards are diverse and have expertise when we're reviewing research. And it's helpful to have experts who really understand, what's happening in a protocol and what types of medical procedures are being used, but also at every panel, as a federal requirement, we're required to have a non-scientist present. And that person really can speak for different groups that might be affected by this research, but not who don't have experience with the specific scientific design of a study. Do you think something like that would be helpful in having at least one to maybe hopefully several other people who don't have that expertise still having a say in what's happening in AI?
Yeah, 100%. Again, for me, this is it's not whether or not it's a good thing. Of course it's a good thing. There's no question that it's a good thing. Is it the most This is an empirical issue. It's not a normative claim. It's not an ethical claim. Is it the most effective at bias mitigation in AI? I've yet to see any empirical evidence for that. There's one paper out of Columbia that provides at least some evidence that that's not the case. So again, I'm all for it. Let's do it. I don't think it's the most effective strategy. I think there are other strategies that need to be prioritized. Yeah.
And I see Tracy has her hand up. So Claudia, if you could move her back to a panelist. I think we just lost her for a second.
Sorry about that.
Oh, no worries. All right, so to get into the questions, the first question we have is because it seems like companies are not thinking seriously about ethical dimensions of what they're doing. How can we educate ourselves about technology and its social and ethical implications and decide what role we want in big tech and social media and what role we would like that to play in our lives?
Yeah, I think as far as I'm concerned, first of all, that's a great question because it really speaks to the individual responsibility that we all have to take on now that the power has moved so far to the edges. I think your best bet is the advocacy groups that surround these issues. So Future of Privacy Forum, EPIC, all kinds of other organizations, and I'm happy to share the list, publish information about these systems on a regular basis. They have a real push for transparency and human action. Even the Mozilla Foundation regularly talks about browser privacy and how to create some protective mechanisms for yourself. I think the education piece is a harder one, and there are fewer and fewer publications that are not directly influenced by the industry itself. I really like MIT's Tech Review. I think they've done a really fantastic job of being politically agnostic as much as you can be with their commentary around technology. I think it's also a difficult space to educate yourself on because you almost have to choose a lane. Do you want to learn about the technology? Do you want to support the efforts for de-identification? Do you want to support the efforts for debiasing data sets for natural language processing? That's one area of learning. This other advocacy area of learning feels much more empowering to me for the average person who just wants to learn about it, teach their kids, help their family protect themselves from inadvertent data losses, and basically just keep tracking all those things on a regular basis. I want to be clear, as much as I do believe we should all go back to living in caves and restart the internet, I do understand and have an iPhone and a Kindle and all of the good stuff myself. There's a real need to balance the trade-offs. The concerns I think we've talked about today are what are going to impact the future generations. And once these things are systemically in place, they will be extraordinarily difficult to remove. And that's the problem. That problem you solve by voting.
Great, thank you.
I think we agree. Yeah, that all sounds right to me. I mean, the one thing that I'm pessimistic about, which Tracy, you sound surprisingly optimistic about, is I don't think that individuals have really any power. You're not going to protect yourself or your family from your data being collected and predictions being made about you using AI, et cetera, et cetera. There's just no way. The system is such that you don't have that power. Now, the collective has power, so vote. But I'm gonna wrap tinfoil around my entire family and protect them from certain kinds of privacy violations that lead to down knock-on effects, knock-on harms. That's not possible, I don't think.
Well, I mean, I'd go a step further, Reed. That's exactly why I would say that it doesn't matter if we have an IRB either. It doesn't matter if you have a philosopher at the table either. That individual has no more power than I do to protect myself from Google or Apple. So I would say it's even harder for that person.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's certainly not the case that having a philosopher at the table by itself makes a difference. The question is, look, there's an issue about whether the most senior leadership of the organization gives a shit. Right? That's about, and I mean about ethics in particular. If they do, and it sounds like the CEO of Axon, the founder of Axon, seems to have really cared. I don't mean to put that in the past tense. Still does. I don't know. If they actually really want to push for it, then they can create boards with a certain kind of authority and power, such that they can have real impacts on how the company operates. That's all. That's the thing. Now, most companies don't have leaders like that, and even if they do, it's really hard to push through. because it's hard to get organizational buy-in on it, which is why having things like regulations is totally imperative. It's not like some hospital decided to have an IRB. It was required by regulations, and now there are IRBs, and now they play a certain kind of role in stopping people from being harmed in various ways during research. Not all the ways, there's problems, I know, but anyway.
Do you see a future where those types of regulations would be implemented, or is it too far?
That's an empirical question that I just have to say I don't have any expertise related to the probability of regulations being passed. I'm skeptical, very skeptical, but there's no real expertise behind that skepticism.
Great. Yeah, it is. It's an interesting. I mean, because I definitely, in terms of IRBs, I'm not sure how effective they would be without the regulations backing them up. All right, I'm just taking a look at other questions, but if you have any closing statements, this panel is going to wrap up at 3:55, so I'll open up to let you know if you'd like to have any last word before we end this panel.
I'll say one last thing about other places that you might look. So there's the AI ethics space, and there's sort of the ethics in business thing. People could also, if they want to, it's like one part education, two parts could get involved. There's the ESG space, which is environmental, social, and governance criteria for institutional investments. And there's issues around sustainability, specifically the UN SDGs, the Sustainability Development Goals. And those are two places. So in my estimation, ESG is Wall Street's word for ethics because they don't want to say the word ethics. And corporate America, anyway, uses sustainability because they don't want to say ethics, but they're really making ethical claims. There's a nascent push to make certain kinds of data ethics and AI ethics standards as part of ESG criteria and sustainability goals. It's at the very beginning, but it's beginning to happen, and that is a potential place where we could see some kind of movement or push to get organizations to do better.
Thanks. Tracy, any last words?
Yeah, none of this is new. So all we're doing is talking about the impact on technology, the impact of technology on humans, right? And that conversation's been happening forever. History, anthropology, all of the ists will be able to tell us a better job. What I think what we really need to focus on is that Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, they all represent a very new political phenomenon. And what we are now facing is a new form of centralized authoritarian governance that is happening in the private sector without any accountability, that is based completely on the commodification of our data. And to talk about bias in that context is important. To talk about algorithmic justice in that context is important. But I would still argue they're all distractions from the real problem. And that, to quote one of the earlier speakers, the kitty has not only left the bag, the kitty has grown up and is chomping its way through your house. It's, we're fast approaching a splitting point where we will not be able to go back and undo these decisions. And so I think whatever mechanism you all settle on, and when I say you all, I mean you and me too, it can only help at this point. I really, really encourage us all to take action. Just think we need to focus on the right problem.
Great. Yeah, thank you both so much for being here. And with that, I'll conclude this panel.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
All right. Claudia, you're back. So thank you all. And I think our last panel especially was an example of how we brought people in from afar. Both Reed and Tracy are not in our area. And thank you both for, it reminded me the presentation of Jane Curtin and Dan Aykroyd. And I don't know if you guys are old enough to know that reference, but it was a fabulous presentation, provocative. It got us all to think. Someone is just texting me, telling me, how wonderful it was. Claudia and Cledwin, thank you for being our behind the scenes people, making sure that we ran technically without a hitch. And please remember to look at your email for a post-conference evaluation. And I am so humbled and just awed by the great conference. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day.